Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. This is the second episode of the story that tells of what if were the second Shinobi World War left Yuzu destroyed out of fear. Its inhabitants were left slaughtered or scattered. However, what if the members of Yuzushiyo's famed Uzumaki weren't as scattered as people thought? What would it mean for one Uzumaki Naruto? After watching, like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Now let's begin. If anyone had told the Sandame that he'd one day be sitting down with part of the elders of the Uzumaki clan over sake in his office, he'd have had that person institutionalized on the spot. Yet, here they both were. Well, sort of. One of them had excused herself to stay with the rest to make sure they didn't get into trouble, in his office, sharing a cup of sake as the rest of the clan remnants waited either at the anteroom, the hallway, the library, or outside the building, seeing as how there wasn't nearly enough space to hold the Uzumaki numbers. For a dead clan, there sure seemed to be a whole lot of them. I still can't believe that after all these years, so many of you managed to escape the destruction of Yuzu. Hiruzen spoke grimly before drinking from his cup, having figured he'd need the liquid courage for this meeting. Boy, had he nailed that call. So many. Keisuke mused just as grimly. So little, you must mean. Yuzushiobikure had many clans, but most of them were kin to the Uzumaki by marriage. Very few of us escaped, he corrected. What you see outside is roughly half of the survivors of Yuzu. That's still quite significant, Uzumaki-san, Hiruzen pointed out. The Hyuga, the most numerous of our clans, numbers maybe a little more than half of your survivors at most. The Hyuga weren't a country unto themselves, Keisuke riposted as he stared down at his cup forlornly. Even as he spoke, he could still see so many faces of deceased loved ones. Too many. It was fortunate any of us escaped the great destruction. Hiruzen, seeing how the conversation was affecting his fellow aged shinobi, decided not to press the point. Nonetheless, the two did have something to discuss. Your advance guard made quite the impression here a couple of weeks ago. Hiruzen switched tracks, offering the man an amused smile. Put over 100 of my men out of commission for the night. That did the trick, as Keisuke snorted before gulping down his cup in one go. Yeah, Yuki told me, he said. Morons had no self-control. To be fair, they were stopping a mob from lynching a small boy. Right, about that, Keisuke's expression grew dark, causing Hiruzen to stiffen. I trust it's been made clear that any further assaults on our clan head will be met with vicious retaliation, he stated more than asked. Hiruzen eyed the elder calmly and quietly for a moment. No, he replied calmly, and just before Keisuke could explode with anger, he put up a halting hand. There's a reason for that. What reason could there be to leave that boy out of his family's protection? Demanded Keisuke. You are not a clan of Konoha, Hiruzen pointed out as he folded his hands on his lap. You have no authority here, either as a clan, or even as individuals. If you wish to exercise either, you must first become part of the village your clansman is part of. That's not much of an issue, Keisuke growled, though his anger seemed to lessen. It was part of our plans to begin with. Oh. But there are issues to that, Hiruzen remarked. If Konoha admits your clan to our ranks, what would happen to your enemies? He asked. Kiri, Kumo, Iwa, Yumifi's 4 nations unbelievably joined forces to erase your home from the map, an unprecedented and unrepeated event, and 3 of these now make up 3/5 of the great shinobi villages. Konoha can scarcely afford having 3 of the world's major powers aiming for it. Hiruzen hadn't wanted to play this card, but after having come down from his high at being the Hokage to preside over the resurgence of the Uzumaki clan, he'd begun to realize the drawbacks that having the seal masters around could bring Konoha. Keisuke, for his part, couldn't fault the Hokage for pointing this out. Any village that claimed the Uzumaki amongst their numbers could soon face the combined fear and hatred of the alliance that had destroyed Yuzushiobikure. Are you saying you will not allow us residents in Konoha? He asked seriously. Hiruzen raised an eyebrow. Not at all, he answered smoothly. I'm just asking a question. If the Uzumaki join Konoha, what could you offer us that would offset the horrible possibility of a 4th ninja war erupting? Negotiation. Keisuke was all too familiar with this game. He'd had to play it with the other elders at their latest meeting, and all of his life before the fall of Yuzu, and even so only one had sided with him. The other two elders had, for all intents and purposes, given up hope on reforging the clan, and were not convinced with Keisuke's guarantees regarding the new clan head. It was far from a lost cause, but Keisuke knew that the clan head would have to personally seek them out and prove himself to them before the family could be truly reunited. The question the Hokage posed, however, had merit. What could the Uzumaki offer Konoha? Naturally, sharing the clan's most prized Fuin techniques was out of the question. He knew, for instance, that the Hyuga never shared a damn thing of theirs with the village, and he wasn't going to be the only one bending over backwards to please the leadership of the village. The Uzumaki weren't lapdogs of anyone. Manpower, I suppose, would be the best answer, Keisuke stated. Our clan may have been diminished in size, but not in power. With the few that have decided to follow me here, I bring you medics, seal masters, summoning specialists, interrogators, torturers, combat specialists of every kind. Konoha's military strength would rise considerably with us around. I should expect so, Hiruzen agreed as he lit his pipe. Yet, what else? Considerable rise in military strength or not, this would hardly put us on par with three of the world's greatest military powers. Keisuke knew the Hokage wanted something, but couldn't figure out what. Narrowing his eyes, Keisuke decided to call the man out on it. What do you want? He asked bluntly. Hiruzen smiled, finally getting to the point. I have no doubts in my ninja's will of fire, he stated as he placed his pipe in his mouth. All of them would gladly fight to the bitter end to protect their homes and comrades, as would I. However, there's no harm in tipping the scales a little, he said, smirking as he thought of his colleague in IWA, by offering our side a boost, is there? No, there isn't, Keisuke agreed warily. So here's what I propose, Hiruzen continued. In exchange for full citizenship, clan status, and lands on which to build your home, Konoha will require the following. First, that the Uzumaki clan will aid our sensor and interception division in strengthening and improving upon the detection barrier and providing backup for the interception team. Second, we will require you to develop new, proprietary seals that would aid in monitoring activity within the village and the village's surroundings. If anything, your infiltration team managed to point out how woefully ineffective our barriers have become, if one had a mind to it, and I would appreciate it if you would give thought to supplying a teacher of basic Fuinjutsu for our academy, as it is a dying art here, he stated. Third, we would also gladly welcome your efforts in strengthening our walls and gates with those remarkable seals of yours, and finally, any cooperation you can give to the hospital, of course, he said with a smile. Keisuke had years to practice not showing overt relief or anger in the midst of negotiations. Thus, when he heard the terms proposed, it was all he could do not to sigh in relief. As terms went, these were well within reasonable, and in no cases was it mentioned that the Uzumaki had to give up their precious techniques. This is acceptable to us, he stated, knowing his sole counterpart dealing with the clansmen outside would concur. Hiruzen smiled genuinely as the negotiations finalized, opening a drawer and picking up a sheet of paper. Excellent, he said with a grin as he placed the paper on his desk and brought out his personal seal. Then may this be the beginning of a wonderful new chapter in the relationship between Konoha and the Uzumaki clan. He declared before stamping it, showing to Keisuke he'd already had everything set up for the Uzumaki's ingression into Konoha's ranks. Naruto was freaking out. When he'd awoken that morning, having gotten used to Hikari's insane training schedule, he'd half expected his kinsman to burst into his room and drag him to the training field. When they hadn't after a few minutes, Naruto had frowned, wondering if something was up. Or worse, what if they were setting him up for another prank? He didn't think he could handle being Maki's experimental test dummy for much longer. Slowly working himself up into a mild hysteria, this feeling was only compounded when he marched out of his room and found the group stonily silent in his living room. Staring around, he'd asked, half expecting them to jump him, "What's up? You all look like someone died." Maki flinched at that, Sora sniffled a bit. Amaya put a comforting hand on Sora's shoulder, and the two boys glared at him. Only Hikari, who was leaning against the wall with her arms crossed, seemed to have it together enough to answer him. Sighing and pushing herself off the wall, she still didn't make eye contact with him. Someone did, she told him. A clansman. The words pierced Naruto's heart more than he thought it would. Having never had family before, he'd nonetheless connected with the group extraordinarily fast. Still, given the small amount of time he'd been around them, he'd half expected to feel a little detached from their problems. Experience taught him otherwise. What? He breathed. Who? No one you knew, Takashi mumbled as he leaned forward and stared at the floor. Anoka, Hikari supplied, ignoring Takashi's rudeness. Uzumaki Anoka. She was killed on mission. Anoka-ne, Sora wept quietly, Amaya's comforting gesture sadly doing nothing to alleviate the girl's sadness. Maki, too, could be heard sniffing. Yuki came by to tell us, Hikari continued through Sora's sobs. She died a week ago. Another name for the tablet, Natsu growled at that and quickly left the room, causing Naruto to look after him confusedly. What's wrong with Natsu? He asked. His parents are on the memorial tablet, too, Takashi spoke up. He gets like that every time it's brought up. Hikari sighed again. Anyway, the clans arrived, she told Naruto. Keisuke Koro is meeting the Hokage, but it should be over soon. You should get ready, she told her future clan head. Anything you want to take to your new home, you better bring it, too. This place is too small for all of us. Naruto blinked a few times before a smile grew from cheek to cheek. Dairy here? He asked, his previous sadness quickly evaporating. My family is here? Despite the tragic news Yuki had given them, Hikari couldn't help the smile that blossomed on her face as she watched the blonde react with genuine happiness at the news. Looking at her clansmen, she saw that they, too, seemed cheered up by his mood shift. Yaso, go get ready, already, she snapped, reverting to her usual drill master personality and pointing at him. Honestly. Do you want your first meeting with the clan to be in your pajamas? Eep. Naruto squeaked before dashing back into his room, the tension in the room effectively shattered and replaced with good-natured chuckles. Naruto wouldn't admit it, but it'd pained him to see his family members suffer so much at the news of a fellow clansman's death. He'd only spent with them 2 weeks, but in that time he'd gotten to know them and already treasured them. He knew Hikari was only acting the part she was most comfortable with, and that Takashi was rude to everyone, but both were well-meaning. Sora had a beautiful heart and capable of hating others. Maki was a little crazy but extremely protective. Amaya was a little aloof, but caring, and Natsu was an idiot but strong and fiercely loyal. Yet, in that instant where he'd walked in on their grieving, none of them had appeared as the clansmen he'd come to know, and it scared him. Was this what it meant to have filial bonds? Would he, too, react that way to the death of a clansman? Up till this point, he'd only ever seen others grieve, but as he had nothing to begin with, he had never experienced it himself. He supposed the closest he'd gotten to that point was when Irika had nearly died at the hands of Mizuki, but even so, his teacher had gotten better, and so had Naruto as a result. Suddenly, getting a family seemed a lot more scary than he'd thought possible. And just as quickly, Naruto crushed those feelings of fear. Family was family, it was the one thing he'd wished for so long, and he wouldn't now let those bonds slip from his grasp. If it came with having to experience such scary feelings, he'd weather it, just as he weathered 13 years of loneliness. In fact, would give it his all to gain the respect of his clan, and protect each and every one of them so they'd never have to grieve again. It was a childish promise, without a doubt, but it was sufficient to give Naruto newfound willpower as he suddenly broke into a mad dash and began packing whatever he considered valuable, which wasn't much, since he rarely if ever got the chance to acquire personal effects. Oi, what the hell's that racket? He heard Hikari yell from the living room. There was no Uzumaki clan compound yet. Nonetheless, when the group, plus Naruto, arrived at the spot of land the Hokage, discreetly. Of course the Mizuki incident hadn't had a chance to blow over just yet, so the Sandaime had wisely decided to minimize Naruto's public presence until it had deemed fit for their use. They could already see various tents pitched up and a few construction scaffolds here and there where they assumed the first few buildings would be set up. To Naruto, even if there was no sprawl of buildings to await him, the experience was amazing nonetheless. As his escorts and he approached the open field, he saw many figures walking to and fro carrying building materials or kids running around playing games, and the sight made him smile eagerly. These were his clansmen, his family. He'd once had the displeasure of coming across a bunch of Hyuga in town, and he'd always thought the big clans like them would act prissy and uptight, but his family shattered that image into itty-bitty pieces. If anything, they were more like what Choji, Kiba, and Shikamaru told him their families were like. And he loved it. Oi! Natsu called out with a wide grin, his earlier grieving all but forgotten as he waved wildly at his clansmen. We're back. A few of the older men who were working on a construction scaffold turned to see who was shouting at them and grinned back at the approaching group. Hey, Natsu's back with the others, one of them called out, quickly snowballing into a chorus of similar shouts and approaching clansmen coming to greet them. After all, there wasn't a person in the Uzumaki clan who didn't know the group's mission. Their return thus meant only one thing. Check it out, it's the clan head. A shout went up as the clansmen gathered with impressive speed and disorganization until the group was all but surrounded by avid clansmen. While Naruto was somewhat taken aback by this sudden onrush of positive-minded people, being that his typical run-in with such a large crowd tended to result in beatings or insult throwing, Natsu and the rest of the group were having a blast. The pink-haired boy was bumping forearms with an older man who was grinning toothfully at the boy, while Maki and Amaya were happily chatting away with some of the older and similar-aged girls. Sora was blushing under the praise of numerous clansmen, while Hikari and Takashi simply basked under the attention they were receiving. So this is the new clan head, he heard one of the men ask, causing serious performance anxiety to rise up in Naruto. Would they accept him? Would they even so much as like him? He was so close to having his family back, was utterly terrified of losing them. Natsu answered by resting an arm on Naruto's head, much to his irritation the pink-haired boy's amusement. Damn straight, he confirmed. He's a brat, but he's got what it takes, I think. There's a scary thought, another clansman shouted, eliciting both laughter from the rest of the clan and a throbbing vein on Natsu's forehead. What was that, asshole? The pink-haired fighting wonder roared. So loud, Amaya clicked her tongue in well-worn annoyance. Where could Yuki-kun be? Pete, please don't start any fights, Natsu and Sora was all but begging the second dragon. A futile attempt, but she couldn't not try. A fight, eh? Takashi mused with a growing grin. Sounds good. Who wants a piece? He challenged. Here we go again, Hikari sighed in exasperation, smacking her forehead. What's that? A fight? Someone called. I'm in. Bring it on, another yelled. I'll take you all on. Natsu roared above all others. Inevitably, a punch was soon thrown, and a person was soon hit, and just as quickly as the crowd had approached the group to welcome them back, the whole thing descended into one massive fight, with only Naruto, Hikari, and Sora not joining in to note. However, the only reason they weren't was because Naruto was a little taken aback at the sudden onset of violence. Hikari knew someone had to explain things, and Sora just didn't like fighting. Even Maki was involved, much to Naruto's surprise. Why is this normal? Naruto asked Hikari, pointing at the ongoing fighting while sweat dropping. Unfortunately, Hikari confirmed. Please stop fighting, everyone. Sora was futilely trying to calm things down. Consider it a family tradition, Hikari told Naruto, ignoring the 14-year-old girl's attempts at defusing the situation. Some clans like performance arts, some enjoy eating, some enjoy writing. We like fighting well, most of us do, she amended as she eyed Sora. Naruto tried to wrap his head around the idea of a family tradition, that is. He'd never had one before, but he knew Choji, Shikamaru, and Kiba all talked of some activities their families enjoyed doing together. So this was his? Eyeing the fighting going around, he couldn't help but note that, as Hikari had said, none of them seemed to be fighting with any malice in mind. He even saw some goofy fights going around, and no one seemed to be bothered by the rampant violence. That was when Naruto felt something odd rise in him. Nothing bad, really, just a feeling of being left out. A grin began forming on his face as he drew up his hands to form a familiar hand seal. Eyeing it, Hikari's sweat dropped as she guessed where this was going. Oi, oi, she mumbled, taking a few steps away from the blonde. Taju Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. Naruto yelled, with suddenly dozens of clones appearing throughout the impromptu battlefield. Let's get this party started, he yelled with gleeful abandon, throwing himself into the fight. Somehow, I knew he'd do that, Hikari groaned to herself as she watched the new clan head and his clone army take on any challengers. While momentarily surprised by the sudden addition to the anarchic fighting, the clones and Naruto were soon welcomed with open arms or fists. Standing there in the sole island of tranquility amongst the sea of mishmashed fighting, Hikari and Sora didn't have to wait long before a rather familiar voice broke up the fighting with a single sentence. What the hell is going on here? Predictably, the fighting screeched to a halt as Kimiko's voice cut through the din. Only Naruto still tried to keep going, but was quickly subdued by a nearby Natsu, who'd paled quickly upon hearing the voice of the feared disciplinarian of the Uzumaki clan. Standing before them in what seemed to be an orange construction jumpsuit, complete with hard hat, which in turn caused mass sweat drops, Kimiko was hauling on her shoulder an impressive load of wooden beams while glaring at the crowd. You all think this compound is going to build itself? Enough playing around. Get to work, she barked. The crowd wasted no time in complying with the redhead's orders, far too afraid to cross her. As they did, however, said disciplinarian noticed three people who hadn't moved a gutsy move, by all accounts. Upon squinting, she recognized Sora and Hikari, both of whom had gone to flank a young, blonde boy wearing a gray shirt and black pants with sets of 3 whisker-like scars on his cheeks. Visitors already? She asked calmly as she approached the trio. Hikari, Sora, who's your friend? You know we're not receiving guests yet. Well, no one had ever accused Kimiko to be quick on the uptake whenever non-fighting topics came up. Hikari nodded humbly, something that shocked Naruto, who'd never seen her act so deferentially in the short time they'd lived together, as she clasped a hand on Naruto's shoulder. I'm here escorting our mission target to Keisuke Koro, she explained, her head bowed in respect. Kimiko's eyes widened a fraction as she immediately realized Hikari's meaning. You meant his boy is? She asked, having never gotten to participate in the scouting mission that had led to this whole situation. Hikari nodded, while Sora smiled toothily. If Keisuke Koro approves of his claim, he will become the next clan head candidate. Of course, things weren't that simple. So this is him? Mused Hayako, the other clan elder, as she inspected the young blonde, her long, faded red hair swaying gently as she rocked herself side to side impatiently. Long, elegant lines gave her face a dignified, matronly look. A little young, isn't he? Keisuke sighed as he blew out some smoke from his pipe, also giving the boy a once-over. I did tell you at the meeting, he reminded his counterpart. I thought you were exaggerating. The two elders fell silent at that as they observed the fidgeting blonde boy, who seemed uneasy at having to sit still on the grass, since there was no clan temple yet to hold the meeting. Best get this started then, Hayako opined, garnering an approving nod from Keisuke. No sense keeping everyone in suspense. Keisuke eyed the small army of Uzumaki clansmen who were all kneeling in perfect formation behind the blonde boy, with the older and more skilled of their numbers sitting at the front. Seeing them gathered there made Keisuke smile, as many of them were acting quite out of character. Kimiko, usually the straight-laced disciplinarian, was practically fidgeting on her knees, her fists clenched and her eyes wide. Next to her, Raiden actually seemed interested in the proceedings, while Akemi, to his right, seemed more serious than anyone could remember the lovable young woman being. Even Natsu and Takashi, the two battle-happy morons, were unusually quiet and serious. For his part, Naruto was really wishing this hadn't an audience. It was tough enough having to meet these two old-timers, both of whom, if he recalled correctly from Kimiko and Hikari's earlier conversation, could determine the path his fate would take him. He now also had to deal with performance anxiety. What if he screwed up? What if they hated him? Hell, what if they found out about the QB and shunned him like the village had? He didn't think he could deal with more rejection, especially from those who were his family. "Let's begin," Keisuke announced, causing Naruto to tense up. Little did he know, but his gesture was replicated by nearly every Uzumaki clansman behind him. "Maki-chan, please take record of the meeting." The red-haired Fuin specialist nodded as she got up from her place amongst the clansmen and walked over to the side of the meeting, quickly summoning a scroll and some writing tools. "Meeting for the establishment of the legitimacy of the claimant's status as an Uzumaki clansman," Hayako droned out, the old protocols hammered into her head in her youth still going strong. Presiding, Uzumaki Keisuke, Elder Uzumaki Hayako, Elder. "With half of the elders present, quorum is achieved," she announced, not even bothering to check if Maki was following, which she was, incidentally. As this bureaucratic process occurred, Naruto swore he could hear snoring coming from behind him. The temptation to look back and confirm was great, but something told him he'd get in trouble if he did. Either way, a resounding smack was soon heard, followed by a yelp of pain and some muffled chuckles. "First order of business," Keisuke grunted as he sucked on his pipe, his eyes never once faltering from their gaze on the blonde boy. "Your name?" Naruto took a moment to realize they were finally addressing him, but quickly stammered out a response. "And Naruto. Uzumaki Naruto." "Maelstrom, a good name," Hayako commented to herself, though Maki wrote it down anyway. "Where were you born, Naruto?" the female elder then asked, maintaining her posture and image of a stern clan elder, which horribly clashed with Keisuke's nearly casual, cross-legged pose. "Here." "Konohagakure, I mean," Naruto quickly amended, figuring they wouldn't want such ambiguous answers. Ordinarily, Irika would have had to pretty much threaten him with chores and no ramen for a month for Naruto to answer so carefully and obediently, but the blonde wanted his family back so much he would have fought all 9 Biju with a roll of toilet paper and sheer dumb luck if they asked it of him. Keisuke nodded. "Parents?" he asked promptly. Naruto looked down. "I didn't know. I've been an orphan all my life," he admitted, a little ashamed of that. Hayako and Keisuke exchanged glances. "It holds up on that end, at least," Keisuke mused to his colleague. "What about your family name?" asked Hayako as she refocused on the boy. "How do you know it if you don't know your parents?" Naruto blinked before thinking hard a feat in itself. "The old Hokage-sama said it was on the birthday thing." "You know, the one where it says when and where I was born?" he prompted, forgetting the term. "Birth certificate," Maki supplied demurely, earning a nod of thanks from Naruto. "Yeah, that," he confirmed. There was a pause then, before Keisuke tapped his knee with his pipe to clear some blockage. Next to him, Hayako folded her hands on her lap and gazed at Naruto steadily. "Are you, in fact, the Jinchuriki of the Kyubi no Yoko?" she asked bluntly. Naruto felt his innards freeze up at the question. They knew. They knew. All at once, every bit of insecurity that had begun assaulting his mind since the Mizuki affair came at him with the force of 1,000 explosive tags. This was it. This was when they would shun him forever, and he'd return to being alone. No, he couldn't handle this. Why again? Why did it have to be him? He was just about to bolt to grieve alone in his self-induced state of pessimistic desperation when Keisuke grunted. "It appears so. Just like his mother." 7 words. 7 words that froze Naruto in place, the tears only barely forming in his eyes. Had he heard right? What? He stammered out. Based on what you've told us, you are the son of Uzumaki Kushina, Keisuke explained idly as he sucked on his pipe. The second Jinchuriki of the Kyubi. It makes sense, Hayako nodded in agreement. Jinchuriki are always, even if by coincidence, chosen due to their closeness to the Kage in our case, our close lineage to the Senju and their will of fire. Lady Mito and Senju Hashirama. Kushina and Sarutobi Hiruzen, Hashirama and Tobarama's pupil, meaning you are probably also Namikaze Minato's son, Keisuke concluded before thoughtfully adding, so, Kushina and he really were serious, wait a second. Naruto cried out, suddenly on one knee and about ready to charge the elders. Why you're screwing with me, right? Me? Namikaze's son, he all but shrieked. Is that so hard to believe? Keisuke asked, bored. Naruto's answer was to point at the distant Hokage monument. You're damn right it's hard to believe, old man. Naruto cried out, a tinge of desperation quickly making itself known in his tone. Namikaze was the fucking yondaime. The guy who beat the Kyubi and sentenced me to a living hell. That's one way to look at it, Hayako agreed, seemingly indifferent at the boy's cussing. Then again, being an elder of the Uzumaki, she'd had to deal with much worse. What other way is there? Naruto demanded, tears streaming as he began to think this was just some giant prank being pulled on him. He believed in you so much he trusted you, a mere newborn, to safely imprison the Kyubi, the most powerful Biju in existence, the one Biju all others fear till the day you die, Keisuke supplied, freezing the blonde in his tracks. As fathers usually do, he added as he eyed Raiden, who looked away from meeting his grandfather's gaze. Naruto was, for the first time ever, at a loss for words. He had not witty comeback to that. No challenge or denial. To be honest, Keisuke's words served to vaporize much, if not all of the resentment he'd felt bubbling inside him towards the yondaime for sentencing him to suffer. Am the yondaime's son? He asked, still shell-shocked. Most likely, yes, Keisuke confirmed with a nod of his head before eyeing Hayako and giving her a nod as well. Hayako, meanwhile, turned towards Maki. We elders recognize the claimant's status as Uzumaki clansman, she informed the girl, who quickly wrote that down before passing the scroll to the elders. In short order, the two elders quickly stamped their personal seals on the scroll where Maki had placed a mark, thereby legitimizing the document. Keisuke smiled warmly at the boy, who was still processing this deluge of information. Welcome to the clan, my boy. Cheers soon exploded from the crowd of gathered clansmen behind him. Naruto had to admit his family sure knew how to party. Even the lack of a roof and four walls had not prevented the Uzumaki from launching a full-scale celebration of his integration into the family. An open-pit barbecue was set up, the more musically inclined members of the clan had unsealed their instruments and played several traditional whirlpool songs, dancers danced away to entertain the clan. In all honesty, Naruto had never once dared to dream being able to participate in something like this. Amidst the shouting, the laughing, and the total lack of any sort of inhibition, Naruto felt more at home than anywhere else he'd been during his short life. Even more amazingly, he'd been seated in between Keisuke and Hayako, at the place of highest honor. To his glee, they were nothing like what he'd assumed during his interview. They weren't uptight or severe. In fact, Keisuke was already smashed and dancing with the dancers drunkenly, to the roaring laughter of the clan. Hayako, for her part, chatted away happily with nearby clansmen, sometimes pausing to answer some of his questions or introduce clan members who drew near to congratulate him. Oh, that's Hiroki, Nobuko-chan's father, she pointed out to another clansman who'd joined Keisuke's drunken dance while laughing like an idiot. He's a very strong member of the clan. He's also an idiot, opined another member, grinning as he clapped along with the other clansmen at the drunken duo's performance amidst the professional dancers. To Naruto's surprise, Hayako merely sighed and nodded. Unfortunately so, more introductions soon followed, most of them quite normal. Oh, and that's Jinpachi, he owns the clan's candy shop. We have a candy shop. Naruto had all but roared, stars in his eyes. Huh. Told you he'd love that, cried out said store owner as he pocketed the money he was reluctantly given by those who'd bet against him. Oh, Hirikoku here is a very good tailor. Most of our uniforms come from him. Said middle-aged artisan smiled at Naruto and bowed to him. Anytime you wish for some clothes, please seek me out, Naruto-sama, he offered humbly. Clansmen need not pay. Oh, that's Akemi-chan, she's one of our finest shinobi, Hayako told Naruto as she pointed a red-headed girl who'd joined Hiroki and Keisuke in their silly dance. Unlike them, however, she was stone-cold sober, and was seemingly doing so just for the kicks. Jumichi works as one of our shinobi trainers, Yukuen actually serves as one of our clan messengers, you know. He's quite good at traveling long distances quickly. Yomi-chan owns the Our Clan Commissariat restaurant, the elder had to amend, seeing the clueless expression on the boy's face. It's quite good food. Is there ramen? Naruto asked directly, his mouth watering from the prospect. Yomi chuckled mirthfully. Of course. We can make any type of ramen you want provided we have the ingredients of course, she assured him. Naruto didn't hear that part, however, given that he was too busy kneeling on the ground and throwing his hands up like some sort of deranged survivor who'd just seen a rescue party finally come for him. It was a testament to the clan's habit of having weird people in it that none of these antics fazed them much. If anything, Naruto's comical reactions to the various introductions and miscellaneous facts about the clan merely served to add to the joyful atmosphere. Of course, since this was the Uzumaki clan one is talking about, eventually someone accidentally punched another in the face. Then that person punched back. Soon, a small fight erupted, which just got much bigger as someone accidentally bumped into Kimiko, making her drop her cake. Kimiko was not pleased. Within 5 minutes, the small fistfight had snowballed into an all-out, all-encompassing brawl. Even the dancers joined in as they threw punches and kicks or grabbed tableware as weapons, all of them grinning fiercely as the celebrations lost any and all decorum. To make things even more ridiculous, Keisuke had managed to fall asleep in the middle of the commotion, dead to the world. Only Naruto and Hayako stayed out of the fighting. To the former's surprise, he even spied Hikari and Sora throwing some punches, and both looked like they were having a blast, despite the latter girl's usual distaste for violence. This is something of a tradition, Hayako tried to explain, smiling peacefully at the growing fight. Hikari-chan told me, Naruto intercepted the elder before she could really go on. The elder blinked and nodded. Ah, good, she said, pleased. Naruto watched the fighting for a moment more before he decided to get a question weighing on him off his chest. Say Granny, why have people been calling me clan head candidate? Hayako made no show of being irritated at the name he called her, and in truth didn't mind. She knew she was old enough to qualify, and since she actually was a grandmother, it would have been hypocritical of her to get insulted. Clan heads must unite the family, Naru-chan, she answered kindly, giving him a nickname of her own and moving slightly to the side to avoid an errant plate. We are many here, but we are not all. 2 cells remain, and before you can become clan head, you must convince these 2 to come back to the family. Naruto blinked and tilted his head, inadvertently avoiding the broken-off leg of a now-destroyed chair. That was it? He just had to convince 2 groups to come to Konoha. That didn't sound so hard. Before you think of running off, you should know it isn't as simple as giving a speech, Hayako preempted him, looking amused. I came here with my group because I believed in Kushina, and any son she had. I believed in Keisuke's word, and I am pleased by what I see, she said, making Naruto blush at the subtle praise. But not everyone is so easily swayed, Naru-chan, she reminded him as she settled her gaze on the ongoing fighting, a small twitch of her lips betraying her growing amusement as she saw Keisuke snore and twitch in his sleep amidst the chaos. Those who didn't come with us need more than words to believe in you. They need to see achievements, power. Naruto made a face and crossed his arms. Sounds dumb. Family is family, right? Hayako seemed startled at the simplistic logic, but beamed warmly at him when she recovered. That's right, Neru-chan, she agreed. But remember, up until we found you, we all lived in hiding. We've suffered so much as a family, Neru-chan, that we're afraid of getting our hopes up. Please try to understand that. Naruto didn't seem too convinced, but Hayako could see he was slowly beginning to accept the situation. I'll try, Granny. That's all I can ask for, I suppose, Hayako mused before patting him on the head, giving him an unexpectedly warm feeling at the caring act. Now, why don't you join in with your clansmen? I'm sure it must have been hard not to jump in at first. Naruto's eyes shimmered in excitement. I can? He asked with a grin. He'd been restraining himself from joining the fight again because of the elder's presence, but if she gave him permission, woohoo. Bring it on, suckers, he roared as he jumped into the fray, decking an older teen clansman in the process. Hayako giggled behind a raised hand. So much like Kushina, unsurprisingly, Keisuke was not pleased when he woke up the next day. Of course, that was partly because of the insane hangover he had, and partly because at some point during the festivities, someone had nailed him in the crotch. Thus, his pain was amplified in a way only a man could know. Even worse was that their neighbors, the Hyuga, had come to complain about the noise while he was still recovering. Needless to say, Keisuke was not in a good mood when he addressed the gathered clan, the meeting now taking place within the roofed scaffolding for the clan temple. So, according to our neighbors, it seems you all had quite a bit of fun last night, he growled as he lay on his back, a conspicuous bag resting on his forehead and cuglower areas. It didn't take a genius to discern these were ice bags. Our neighbors even seemed to think we snuck into their compound to play pranks on them, Keisuke continued, hearing a few clansmen swallow audibly. They were especially displeased with the streaker who ran through their clan compound. At this, the whole gathered clan sweat dropped, none of them having the courage or insanity to point out that he'd been the perpetrator of that particular stunt, having woken up still blind drunk in the middle of the Uzumaki's merrymaking and apparently deciding to go streaking while cackling insanely. It was just as fortunate no one had caught a clear sight of him, as he'd been using his signature technique to increase his size. Yes. Both sizes. Either way, seeing as how no one had a death wish, they all remained stoically silent as he continued to list off the damages and pranks they'd apparently all done the prior night. It was at this point that Naruto realized why they needed a clan compound. It wasn't to keep people out so much as it was to keep the Uzumaki in. Without a wall to keep them inside and easily managed, the Uzumaki were liable to go on wild, mass collateral damage-inducing rampages whenever their tempers flared or a party was thrown. Anyway, Keisuke ranted as he rattled off every act of collateral damage the clan had caused as a result of the party, which, considering the amount of items he was going through, was an impressive few. Amongst the front row of the clansmen, Naruto leaned over to Akemi, who he'd found to be the perfect older sister he'd always envisioned. "Is this also tradition?" he asked, uncertain. The redhead smiled down at him and patted his lap, which was growing sore from all the size sitting. Yep, she confirmed, much to his dismay. After the party, the lecture. Don't worry, he's finishing soon. And Natsu, for the last time, you cannot go into a town and proclaim yourself super awesome dragon lord while wearing nothing but your underwear and scarf. Keisuke continued lecturing, causing Naruto to sweat drop at the fact that no one seemed even remotely surprised. I was drunk, said drunken exhibitionist defended himself. Don't care. And Yuki, no more losing your pants near a school. Keisuke reprimanded the dark-haired teen. I don't want the local parents group to come and deliver a restraining order this time around. It was an accident. Not interested. Keep your clothes on, damn it. Keisuke shot the boy's excuse down. Daisuke, no more punching villagers if they disagree with you on what defines a man. Grumbling answered him. What was that? Nothing, Keisuke nodded. I thought so. Lastly, we must address the issue of Naruto's graduation exam, due to happen in 2 days, he stated gruffly. Said blonde stiffened as the subject came up, though Hayako took over for Keisuke, now that he'd gotten his chance at ranting. As you know, Naruto, Hikari and the advance guard managed to give you a respite of 2 weeks to bring you up to scratch for the exam, Hayako stated. She has since reported that you are passable. Thus, later today, as many of us as we can will be in attendance to watch you succeed in a preliminary exam, in order to see how you fare against the rest of us. After that, we will proceed with training you up as much as possible to Uzumaki standards before the actual graduation test, after which we shall draw up a more appropriate training regimen for you. Is that understood? She asked calmly. Naruto swallowed. It was bad enough he knew he had to retake the exam, but now he was going to have another exam? Worse yet, against his family? You understood, he acknowledged with a nod. Hayako smiled as she nodded. Good. Get some training in, then, she suggested. It wouldn't do for the Tashu Koho of our clan to perform sloppily. Even though it had been a suggestion, Naruto had the distinct feeling it was anything but. High. To say Naruto passed the clan's preliminary exam with flying colors was an understatement. The elders had been glowing at him as he, barely, finished the obstacle course easily, the most sadistic exam he'd ever had to go through, all courtesy of Kimiko, who insisted that was her daily training ground. He still refused to believe that. Arriving at the academy early the next day, the elders had insisted on it, and had even assigned a small squad to ensure he was early. Naruto had then proceeded to thoroughly shock Iruka and his classmates by not picking a fight with anyone, or even being loud. To be fair, the glares his minders were giving him were a good deterrent from doing so. Either way, knowing he wouldn't be able to resist flying off the handle if he sat next to Sasuke or near Sakura or Ino, the blonde had picked the one place he knew he couldn't get dragged into trouble in between Shino, the creepy bug dude, and Hinata, the weirdo who kept blushing and poking her index fingers together whenever he looked at her. As expected, even as Iruka shakily began explaining the special graduation exam, the poor man was still in shock at Naruto's sudden personality flip. Naruto found it impossible to cause a scene. Shino was about as personable as a brick wall covered in a layer of ice, while Hinata was quiet, albeit for a different reason, not that he could tell, granted. Also, he could swear that he felt Kimiko's glare on him, daring him to even try. As I was saying, the instructor regained his footing slowly, causing the class to eye him in deadpan. You were all notified to attend this special graduation exam due to mitigating circumstances that arose during the normal one, Iruka stated, now more confident and starting to appreciate the lack of interruptions. As a result of the tampering of a now convicted traitor, the impartiality of the exams you took were thrown into question by the Uzumaki, he didn't say, not wishing to visit trouble on his pseudo-younger brother, and as such, Hokage-sama has determined that in the interests of fairness, a new exam had to be issued, under his direct supervision. Naturally, this all elicited groans from the class, except for a certain few Hinata, who was too shy to protest Shino, who nodded at the logic employed by the Hokage, and Iruka Sasuke, who grunted and looked out the window, no doubt confident nothing would change, in Naruto, who'd already had the circumstances explained to him and having been present at the moment of the decision. In fact, if Iruka had to guess, Naruto seemed positively giddy. Which was odd, considering the boy loathed academics, and by extension, tests. Now, the test will happen in the following manner, Iruka continued, a little unnerved at the blonde's excited disposition. He grabbed a piece of chalk and began writing a list on the blackboard. First is a written exam, for which you will receive 20% of the final grade, he stated. Then, after the 3 basic exams, a physical conditioning exam, during which your stamina and resourcefulness will be tested in a simulated combat scenario, he continued, finally showing the first real deviation from the standard exam process. This had been a point stressed upon by the Hokage and agreed to by Hamura and Koharu, though Danzo had disagreed, on grounds it would severely diminish their shinobi numbers. Unlike before, it is mandatory to pass this section of the exam, or else you will be immediately disqualified. You've all undergone the survival exercises here at the academy, so there is no excuse if you fail, he leveled a warning glare at the class, which had been about to protest quite vocally. This portion of the test will take place this evening, after the Genjutsu, Ninjutsu, and Taijutsu exams, each of which will take up 20% of your grade. Unlike before, it is not necessary to pass all of these last three with perfect scores, he added, eyeing Naruto, who'd been a glaring case of how skewed the regular exam was. Other than the mandatory pass for the physical conditioning exam, it will be necessary for you to accumulate a minimum total of 75 points in order to graduate, he stressed as he finished writing on the board and circled the 75 he'd written several times. Finished, Iruka watched as his students squirmed in their seats, smiling as he did so. He had no doubts that those who'd graduated before the retake would graduate again, and now that the exam was rebalanced into a fairer setup, he had no doubts Naruto would surprise everyone. The exam will begin in 2 hours, he stated. This had been arranged in order to give the children a chance at last-minute studying and practice, though another reason was so that the Hokage could clear enough of his schedule to attend the exam. While you are free to stay here and study, or use the yard outside to train, you may not, under any circumstances, use this time to consult with your clans, families, non-academy friends, or acquaintances for aid or request or receive any items from anyone outside of this class, understood? Normally, such a warning wouldn't have needed such specificity, but Iruka had long since learned that when dealing with Shinobi, any loopholes one left open would undoubtedly end up being abused. He smiled as he watched all 33 students nod their heads. Very good. See you in 2 hours, then. Don't be late, he called out as they began to rush out of the room for their lockers or the yard. Uzumaki compound, how was it? Keisuke asked plainly as Naruto's bodyguard squad kneeled before him and Hayako at the, still being built, meeting hall. Noticeably, the lack of walls sort of made the whole affair a lot more ridiculous looking. Jean, a rather muscular-looking man with fading red hair, bowed his head a little deeper. About as expected, Keisuke Koro, he answered. The populace seems uncertain how to react in the face of our arrival and claim on Naruto-sama, he added. For the most part, confused stares greeted us along the road, though there were still the occasional stares of condescension, suspicion, and outright disgust. Keisuke frowned as he took a drag from his pipe and blew out smoke. While the initial scouting team had indeed reported the town's seeming antagonism towards Naruto, allowing him to color his expectations of the populace's reaction to the Uzumaki arrival, he admittedly had apparently placed too much faith in the people's collective memory of the Uzumaki clan and their deeds in helping Konoha in the past. Apparently, it was too much to ask for Konoha's citizens to remember their once great allies. We must bear in mind that Naruto-sama's condition will undoubtedly cause many to carry over their sentiments towards the clan, Hayako pointed out, albeit sadly. It was perhaps too much to hope for that they would see past his status as Jinchuriki once it became common knowledge we'd claimed him. We were naive to think that clan status would remove that stigma, Keisuke concurred with a nod as he tapped his pipe lightly, causing some blockage to fall out. The question now is should we attempt to ingratiate ourselves, or ignore the populace's sentiment? I vote in favor of ignoring them, Hayako stated firmly, but then she'd always been something of an isolationist. Let them think what they will, our actions will prove them wrong. I vote ingratiation, Keisuke stated without missing a beat after his co-elder had spoken. We need the populace's goodwill for our businesses to function properly. Allowing hostility to fester will do us no good. No one else in the room spoke up, as was customary in Uzumaki tradition. Only the elders and clan head could vote on such decisions, even though the clan head could overrule the elders any time a tie or close vote occurred. Unfortunately, with only 2 of the 4 elders present and no de jure clan head to rule on the tie, the 2 elders were left at an impasse. You haven't changed a bit, Keisuke, Hayako pointed out with a frown. You've always been so fond of giving people second chances. And you've changed less, Hayako, Keisuke countered calmly. The Uzumaki have every right to participate in the world at large. We should not be so eager to vote away that right. The world at large destroyed our nation and family, Hayako shot back. They abandoned us without a second thought. Keisuke frowned. The last few days had been a wonderful reminder of the happiness and benign chaos the reunited Uzumaki were capable of, but he'd apparently chosen to forget the politicking that accompanied a reunited council of elders. In particular, the issue of Uzushio's abandonment by the shinobi world. It had been one argument that, without the emergency of Uzushio's imminent fall and the Uzumaki's subsequent decision to split for safety purposes, would have threatened an Uzumaki civil war even as Yuzu-no-Kuni came under siege. "We are not having this argument again, Hayako," Keisuke stated firmly. "This council is not complete, and we have no clan head to rule on it," he reminded his counterpart. The faded red-headed woman glared at Keisuke for a moment before reluctantly nodding. Whatever disagreements they had, the two elders knew that the unity of the clan was now more important than ever. Having an ideological split this early on in the clan's reunion would only have catastrophic consequences. Instead, Keisuke turned his attention to the red-headed woman kneeling silently next to Jean in a similar pose, quietly waiting to be called on. "What about you, Kaori? What happened with our attempts at reaching out to the clans?" That had been the second part of Keisuke's proposed, and accepted, plan for the Uzumaki clan settling in Konoha. First was to gauge the populace's feelings towards them, and simultaneously reach out to the established clans. With any luck, shinobi professionalism would outweigh any personal recriminations they might have towards Naruto. "We've met with partial success, Keisuke Koro," she answered with utter professionalism, not once showing any signs of discomfort at having been witness to a disagreement between elders. "The Nara and Akimichi seem willing to trade and acknowledge us as friendly acquaintances, though the third of that familial alliance, the Yamanaka, have opted to take a more reserved approach. They claim to want to see our contributions first before making their decision." "What of the others?" Hayako questioned as her counterpart nodded in approval. "The Inuzuka seem wary of us," Kaori responded immediately. "Given their clan's penchant for animalistic outlooks on life, my team has come to the conclusion that this is due to their need to know where we stand in a canine-like hierarchy. In short, whether we are alphas or followers." Keisuke snorted. "Sounds about right," he deadpanned. "I can think of a few clansmen who'd love to settle that one." "As can I," Hayako said with a ghost of a smile. Still, she kept her stern facade. "What else?" "The Hyuga are more problematic," Kaori continued, frowning for the first time as she mentioned the clan's neighbors. "In numbers, they are the closest to us, even though a large gap still exists that is not quickly diminishing," she explained. "However, before we came here it was enough to warrant having a significant share of prestige we have now, in their eyes, stolen from them. In addition, our actions during the feasts, as well as our general reputation for orderliness, seems to have struck an ill chord with them. They are currently stonewalling any preferential trade agreement with us, and seem to have little patience for our presence within their compound." The two elders exchanged glances then, uncertain how to proceed. "This was to be expected, really," commented Hayako with a small, defeated sigh. "In terms of clan personality, we're far too much an opposite force to them. Not to mention that insufferable pride of theirs," Keisuke grunted as he closed his eyes to ponder on the issue. Hayako nodded and turned back to Kaori. "What of the rumors about them?" she asked. "Is it true?" Kaori nodded. "It is. One of my men was able to sneak a glance at the seal on a branch member's forehead. It isn't one of ours," she stated with conviction. "However, it seems to be a bastardization of our work. Specifically, the detention seal," she added as she brought forth a scroll and unraveled it, letting the elders see the reproduction of the seal. The two elders gave the seal a hard stare for a moment before disgust creeped up on Keisuke's face. "Bastardization indeed," he growled. "Those pain parameters have no business being there." Hayako was more conserved with her opinion, on the other hand. "It also seems to have integrated elements of the Yura Shisho," she pointed out. "Specifically targeted at parts of the genetic code, however." Kaori nodded at both elders. "Marui agrees, Koro-sama," she informed them. It seems likely that what we've been told about the Hyuga's policy towards their Kekkei Genkai is true. Hayako shook her head sadly while Keisuke frowned deeply. Sealing arts being used to keep family in line, Keisuke grumbled in disgust. Shameful, Hayako agreed. Absolutely shameful. Yet, regrettably, quite outside our influence, Keisuke sighed before taking another drag and blowing out smoke. What about the others? Have they been integrating well into their new assignments? It is too early to say, Koro-sama, Jean answered. However, there appears to have been little friction between our clansmen and the shinobi forces. Mostly, the animosity seems contained to the non-combatants, as previously mentioned. Some good news, at least, Hayako grumbled. Remind the clan that we expect reports regarding their work on a bi-weekly basis. If there are any signs of suspicious activity within Konoha's ranks, we cannot afford to ignore it. Keisuke was of a mind to object to that, but had to restrain himself given that he'd already reluctantly agreed to such reports in a previous meeting with Hayako. The truth was that as much as he wished he could trust Konoha's population implicitly, there was just too much risk that they could be sold out to their enemies, in which case, it was necessary for the Uzumaki to have their eyes open for any warning signs of betrayal. It depressed the elder man greatly, but it was something he'd had to come to terms with. Jean, Kaori, you're dismissed, he told the two shinobi kindly, not even blinking when they suddenly moved out of view. Instead, he turned to Hayako and sighed. Now, since we've managed to get that old monkey to agree to the survival exam, you think it's a good time to bring up that other thing with him? Hayako's cunning smile was all the answer he needed. The training yard was chaos incarnate. Thoroughly unnerved by Irika's lecture about the upcoming marathon of an exam, the students of Naruto's class had scampered about in order to dig up old notes, exam shell, anything that had a shred of facts on it. A few girls even burst into tears at several points, the abrupt stress getting to them. Sakura, to Naruto's approval, was one of the few, along with Ino and Hinata, who managed to keep it together, though it quickly became apparent that this was solely due to her self-assurance at her performance in academics. The physical conditioning part, on the other hand, had her in nervous tatters. In fact, most of the girls in the class seemed equally troubled by the addition of such a test. What the boys had failed to realize, except maybe for Shikamaru, Choji, Shino, and Kiba, was that as a result of preconceived perceptions of what qualified as beautiful, never mind that they were only just entering their teen years, most of the girls had engaged in highly unbalanced diets that left them with very little protein in their bodies, and as such, muscle mass and stamina. The strongest girls in the class were, predictably enough, Ino and Hinata, and with good reason. The Yamanaka clan were experts at psychology no matter what age the patient was. Thus, Yamanaka Inoichi, the current clan head and Ino's father, had quickly seized on the psychological development of his daughter and noted her slow movement towards eating disorders before immediately putting a stop to it. As such, despite having spent months furious at her father, Ino remained one of the healthier girls in the class, though she still lacked muscle mass. Hinata, on the other hand, was firstly of the Hyuga clan, and secondly not all too worried with impressing a certain duck-butt-haired boy. This meant two things: one, that neither her father nor the elders of her clan would ever allow her to follow the other girls' example and in so doing weaken herself, more than they already thought her to be, that is, and two, she didn't feel the need to conform to other girls' definition of beauty, especially as her mother, before she died, had always called her a beautiful girl. In fact, in terms of looks, Hinata had little to no confidence issues. If anything, her shattered self-confidence mostly, if not entirely, revolved around her combat abilities. As Shinobi, her looks always came second, whereas her ability to distinguish herself in the field always came first, which was why she was considered such a failure by her clan, and why her self-confidence remained low. Unlike her branch house cousin Niji, she just didn't have the intuitive skill for juken. No, that wasn't quite right. She did have the skill for it. She just loathed the idea of harming others. What this meant, however, was that both girls had a leg up on their competition in the physical conditioning test, and so were more focused in their own areas of weakness, taijutsu for Ino, ninjutsu for Hinata. On the boys' side, most of their worries revolved around the written test and the genjutsu exam, since the fine chakra control the latter demanded was not one the boys were too inclined to practice. Even Sasuke, the class prodigy, didn't waste the break period lazing about, having hit the books the moment the class had been dismissed. Call the boy whatever you want, Ted was a diligent student all the way. What surprised most of the class, however, was the sight of Nara Shikamaru studying like a man possessed. Oh, the living monument to lazy bachelor stereotypes didn't care about passing with flying colors, but the rise of the minimum pass grade to 75 points and the inclusion of the survival test were indicators that he had to get his ass in gear for once. At first, he hadn't bothered to go further than 75 points in his calculations, but one whispered comment, red thread, from Ino regarding tattling to his mother had banished the laziness out of the pineapple-haired boy and gotten him to roar at his classmates to leave him alone while frothing at the mouth as he studied like crazy. Only Choji remained near his friend during Shikamaru's meltdown. Naruto, for his part, remained mostly outdoors, knowing he sucked at genjutsu, rocked at ninjutsu, and was passable at taijutsu. The written portion? Well, had learned enough under Maki, Amaya, and Sora's watchful eye, thanks to his Kage Bunshin. Survivability exam? No problem living on your own for most of your life, effectively guaranteed top-notch survival skills are an early grave. Thus, he focused on the one thing he could improve during the short break, his taijutsu. Yet, who to ask for help? Kiba would have been the obvious choice, but the wild boy, quickly realizing he sucked at way too many classes, had gone on a studying rampage the likes of Shikamaru's. Said lazy boy, in turn, would probably find a way to frame him for some horrible crime if he dared interrupt his studying marathon, and Choji was more worried about the written portion than the rest of the exam. Shinona. Bug Boy freaked Naruto out. Always silently staring at you behind those dark glasses, Naruto shivered. He thought about challenging Sasuke, but the boy was brushing off everyone as he crammed. That left the girls, which didn't quite appeal to Naruto, seeing as how he hated fighting women. It just seemed summon. Then again, he did recall that most of them seemed to be on par with him in taijutsu. Ino, for instance, was pretty much where he'd been before getting picked up by the Uzumaki clan. Plus, she was really smart, always aggregately scoring at the top of the class alongside Shino and Sasuke. If anyone could determine any salient flaws that his family hadn't been able to get to, it was her. Plus, she was practicing taijutsu at the moment. So why not take advantage of the situation? Going over to his fellow blonde, he raised his hand in greeting and grinned. Asu, Ino. Ino stopped in mid-kata to glare at Naruto. She didn't particularly hate the boy, but she did find him annoying at times. That said, he'd made a vast improvement in her books after having ditched the hideous fashion faux pas he called a tracksuit. What do you want, Naruto? She asked rudely. Can't you see I'm training? Sweat dropping at the hostile greeting, Naruto demonstrated his stubborn streak by not backing down. He tried to wave away the hostility, to little effect. I was just thinking, oh Kami, really? She mocked gasped. Naruto flinched, but kept his composure. Since you're practicing taijutsu, why not have a spar with me? I'm trying to work out the kinks in my style, but my family hasn't been able to fix all of it. Being part of one of Konoha's distinguished ninja clans, Ino of course had learned of Naruto's estranged family having arrived and taken him in. While she was happy for the blonde, thinking that no child should go without the warmth family provided, that didn't make him any less of an idiot and an annoyance. Still, he had a point. She could practice katas until the cows came home, but none of that would compare to actual sparring experience. She clicked her tongue in annoyance. Fine, but so help me, Naruto, if you try anything funny, she threatened. There was a reason why girls and boys sparred in segregated groups, after all. The temptation was just too big for boys undergoing puberty not to try something with their female classmates. Naruto raised his hands in self-defense. I know, he hastily reassured her. I won't do anything, promise. Ino still kept a suspicious glare leveled at him, but nodded at his vow. That would have to be good enough, she supposed. All right, she agreed. Rules? Just taijutsu, no crippling blows, nothing that would put the other out of shape for the exam, Naruto offered. Ino nodded, agreeing with the terms. Sounds good. Come on, she led her fellow blonde to the sparring circle, where she took a stance. Naruto wasted no time in doing the same opposite her. Want to give the signal? Naruto asked as he slid into what seemed to be a bastardized form of the Juken stance, greatly surprising Ino and shocking Hinata, who'd taken a small break from her ninjutsu training to spy or observe Naruto. Shaken, Ino nonetheless regained her calm as she figured Naruto had just seen Hinata spar at some point and decided the fighting style was cool. Satisfied with that mental conclusion, she nodded. Yeah. On three. Naruto nodded. Three, she vocalized, her muscles, or what passed for muscles in the skinny girl, tensing. Two, Naruto continued, his own muscles going rigid. One, neither vocalized as their eyes narrowed. Zero. In a flash, Naruto's eyes widened as he gracefully, or what passed for graceful at age 13, swerved aside on his heel, easily dodging Ino's sudden, snap kick, which would have decked the blonde in one go if he'd stayed still. Quick on the uptake, Naruto aimed an open palm at Ino's ribs, only for the girl to lean forward and use her extended leg as a pivot to launch another kick at Naruto, who quickly jumped to the side, avoiding this one as well. Already, in two moves, Naruto had impressed Ino, who admittedly had never seen such a fighting style before in her life. She'd imagined, by Naruto's stance, that he'd be copying the Hyuga's form of fighting which, while arguably mostly offensive, was still rather straightforward. No one she'd ever fought before had used circular movements to fight. Grimacing as she returned to a ready stance, she watched warily as Naruto started moving in circles around her, which she strove to match so she'd never show him her exposed areas. Unfortunately, she wasn't accustomed to moving around so much on the same spot, and eventually she stumbled on herself ever so slightly, which was all Naruto needed. With a grunt of exertion, Naruto launched another barrage of attacks at Ino's exposed side, which she quickly dodged, cursing as she realized she was now on the defensive. Where the hell had the boy learned to fight like this? Whenever he sparred against Sasuke, he just charged his opponent like a bull. Quickly returning to her stance, she launched herself at the blonde boy, determined to regain the momentum of the fight. Launching a jab, she was shocked to see Naruto deflected away and using her momentum to close the distance, until he was far too close for any sort of attack to be effective. Uzumaki Hakusho, he called out, both arms thrusting forward. Futego Tenkusho. What sounded like a really extravagant technique was simply, for the purposes of this fight, Naruto slamming both of his open palms into Ino's stomach at full force, launching her backwards. Yet, despite its incomplete state, the technique, reinforced by Naruto's sheer natural strength, was enough to knock the wind out of the Yamanaka heiress as she landed roughly on her back and wheezed painfully. Naruto stayed in his attack position for all of a second before realizing what he'd done. Suddenly fretting that Ino would kick his ass for having hurt her so, he quickly rushed over and bowed deeply while apologizing, two things no male opponent would have ever seen him do to them. Oh crap, I'm so sorry, Ino, he apologized over and over again as he helped the blonde back onto her feet. The attempt failed, merely leaving the girl sitting on the ground, which was some improvement, the two imagined. What? She gasped, still trying to get her breathing under control. What the hell was that, Naruto? She asked, wide-eyed. She could scarcely believe how easily she'd been brought down by someone who she'd estimated to be around her level in taijutsu just 2 weeks ago. Naruto, on the other hand, was scratching the back of his head with a nervous smile. He chuckled nervously. It's something my clansman taught me. Your clan knows Juken? Ino all but shrieked, grabbing the attention of a few students before Shikamaru's hysterical roar of "Shut up!" was heard from within the building. Both Ino and Naruto's sweat dropped as the lazy boy's meltdown continued. Hinata, who had foregone her training to investigate this seeming leak in her family's fighting style, also sweat dropped at the Nara boy's crazed cram session, though she quickly recognized that whatever Naruto had been using, it wasn't Juken. Said troublemaker confirmed her suspicions by shaking his head with a smile. Nah, we can't use that stuff according to my cousin, he said, folding his hands behind his head and staring up at the sky. He calls this style the Uzumaki 8 trigrams palm style, he corrected her. Instead of using chakra to disrupt the chakra coils, we use chakra manipulation to enhance our strength. He stated, though to Ino it sounded like he was reciting a lecture from memory. Unbeknownst to both of them, Hinata gasped as she quickly realized the potential of such a style in the hands of a fully offensive and powerfully built warrior. Ino might have gotten there first, if it wasn't for the fact that she had no idea how the gentle fist actually worked, having to take her fellow blonde's words at face value. But why the circles? She half asked, half demanded. Naruto shrugged. Did you notice how hard it was to land a hit on me? He pointed out, garnering a comprehending nod from Ino. Yemi cousin gave me a hell of a time with this style. If you think I was slippery, he's practically untouchable. Ino's mind was quick at work as she digested this information. Her first instinct was to gossip about this new style like crazy, but her ninja training and her father's teachings immediately ruled that out, given that Naruto, for better or worse, was a Konoha citizen, and thus an ally. Allies didn't rat out allies. On the other hand, she felt her respect for the troublemaker rise a few notches. Fighting under a discipline that actually required well-discipline must have been hell on the hyperactive boy. It spoke well of his character that he'd been able to buckle down and actually learn the style. Though that brought up another question, one that bugged both Ino and Hinata. How the hell had he learned it to this proficiency in 2 weeks? When asked, Naruto gave Ino an apologetic smile and a bow. Sorry, can't say just yet, he excused himself. I gave the elders my word. Ino was about to protest, but found herself unable to. She knew what that was like. When clan elders, in the absence of a clan head, ordered something, you did it without question. It was something both her and Hinata could relate to, though both were sorely disappointed the lack of answers. Checking her watch, however, Ino noticed that only 10 minutes had passed since the spar had ended, which had taken less than that. That meant they still had well over an hour and a half to burn before the exam. A big part of her was furious at having been so easily defeated, but her competitive streak refused to yield. Up for another match, she challenged as she got back up and dusted herself off. She gave Naruto a confident grin. This time, I won't go down so quickly. Naruto smiled, happy at not having alienated the girl. For her part, Hinata felt something weigh down on her heart as she watched Naruto happily accept Ino's challenge. Why couldn't she be the one he was sparring against? Why couldn't he rely on her to improve himself? Of course, there was an obvious reason for all this. Her self-confidence was so shot, Naruto rarely ever got to see her in action. As such, he had no idea how strong she was, or could be, so there was no real reason to seek her out for training. In the end, Hinata had to conform herself with observing Naruto's fights, making mental notes on his stance, mistakes, and openings. Even if she couldn't tell him to his face, maybe a written note would suffice. The moment soon came, and the exams were upon the 33 students. All of them filtering into the classroom like prisoners on death row, even Shikamaru, who'd been booted out by Iruka in order to prepare the room for the Uzumaki guests and the Hokage. All 33 students bowed to the exalted guests in the room before getting to their seats, silently gossiping about the village's newcomers. The arrival of the Uzumaki had, predictably, caused every sort of reaction under heaven throughout Konoha. There were those who were excited at the survival of the ancient blood allies of Konoha, those who were skeptical about the newcomers and their rowdy ways, and those silently hostile due to past grudges between their ancestors and the Uzumaki. Not that any of it surprised the clan of red-headed crazies after all. There wasn't a village under heaven that didn't have a couple of feuding families. Most of the time they just buried the animosity and were assigned to different squads, so there wasn't much reason to intervene beyond that. As Naruto came in, he did the customary bow before looking at his clan elders and grinning wide, waving at them happily. Even with a distinguished family backing him, Naruto couldn't help some of his more typical behavior. To everyone's surprise, the elders returned the smiles and waves despite their exalted positions as the Hokage's guests. "Stop waving and move." Shikamaru hissed behind him, that crazed look still in his eyes. Naruto's sweat dropped as the boy did a record time bow and dashed for his seat, eyeing the clock like the object was his eternal enemy. Hell, if the Nara boy wasn't careful, Naruto would bet he'd snap the pencil he was holding, his grip was so tight. Apparently, the boy took the threat of a scolding from his mother quite seriously. Making a note of that for future use and abuse, Naruto took his seat between Shino and Hinata, both of whom gave their own customary greeting to the blonde, read a nod from Shino, stuttering from Hinata. Then, when the rest of the students had taken their seat, Irika moved to the center of the front of the room and smiled at them, holding a stack of papers in his hands. "Good to see you're all on time, even you, Shikamaru," the scarred Chunin said with a chuckle. He'd been quite amused at seeing the Nara heir go nuts over the exam, seeing as how he'd had to put up with the boy's laziness for too many years. "As I said earlier, this will be the first portion of your exam," he reminded the students. "This portion is a written test of 34 questions in length. You have 2 hours to finish," he announced. "Please don't start answering until I've finished giving out the exam." 5 minutes was all that announcement took, yet in that time Shikamaru had looked like he was about to undergo several dozen heart attacks and brain aneurysms. Smiling at the varying reactions from his students, Irika glanced at the guests in the room, who nodded back. Raising his hand as he looked down at his watch, he waited until the second ticker hit the 12 mark. "Exam start," he announced. No sooner had he finished saying that the sound of pencils scratching like crazy could be heard coming from everyone. Smiling, Irika took his seat to the left of the Hokage, who looked at the students like a proud grandfather. Together, the two guests, Hokage and Chunin, settled in for the wait as the students diligently filled out their exam sheets. As they did, they took note of varying incidents during the test. At the 30-minute mark, one girl had burst into tears all of a sudden and rushed out of the room, prompting a few unsettled looks, but otherwise no one else seemed to get deterred from their task. Irika had to pop out to make sure the girl was all right, however. Even so, she did admit she wasn't ready for the exam and agreed to stay on another year. Even reminding her that she didn't have to pass perfectly didn't deter the girl. Then, at 45 minutes, Irika and the others started to notice that Shikamaru was chanting something to himself in a low voice. Upon straining their hearing, they almost burst out laughing as they realized he was maniacally chanting "Kediai" over and over again, as a show of determination. By the hour mark, another few girls excused themselves before loudly crying once they'd left the classroom. They, too, opted to stay on another year. A few minutes later, the first of the boys to drop out did so after signaling his frustration by slamming his head against the desk over and over again. Soon after, another boy dropped out after literally laughing like crazy and then imitating a cow. Suffice to say, by the time the exam was over, only 25 students were left in the running out of the original 33. Those that were left, however, felt pleased with themselves at having held out. Strangely, though, the exam itself hadn't been as difficult as the amount of dropouts had suggested. Rather, from what Irika had gathered, it was the pressure to perform under the scrutiny of clan elders and the Hokage. Add that pressure to the fact that they also had to perform well on the survival test, which not everyone excelled at, and you had a recipe for culling full week from the herd. Of course, there was no way for another retake to be issued on those grounds. If any parent wanted to object, the Hokage merely had to inform them that their children would have to act under even more pressure. If they couldn't handle the pressure of taking a simple written test in his presence, then they either weren't ready for shinobi life, or weren't suited for it. The next 3 exams, for their part, happened with little trouble. Being that these had remained fairly similar to the ones they'd taken 2 weeks ago, the remaining students were more at ease, even with the added special spectators. It wasn't until the taijutsu exam, however, that the class began to witness some changes. Having failed the genjutsu exam just barely, which hardly put him out of the running, especially if he got the grade he estimated for himself in the written portion, Naruto had aced the ninjutsu exam under the pleased gazes of his clan elders. When taijutsu came up, however, the elders were more than pleased at his performance. They were ecstatic, even if they didn't show it outwardly. For once passably trained in taijutsu, thus putting him on the level on most of the boys in his class, Naruto had held his ground admirably against Kiba, who had won, though it was a close call. Even after they were done, the Inuzuka had simply stared at him for a moment before grinning and holding out his closed fist to the Jinchuriki, who grinned back and bumped it with his own while Akamaru yipped happily. He may have lost his fight, but at least he'd gained the respect of the clan elders and Kiba. Even Sasuke had glanced at him with some pleasant surprise, though he just as quickly reverted to his brooding persona. When the spars were over, however, the students finally became nervous, as the survival test loomed ahead. This was the true unknown of the exam, and all of them had to admit they were a bit intimidated. Leading the kids to a secluded area within a mile of the wall, though the students were unable to determine that thanks to a nifty genjutsu the Hokage applied, Iruka turned to his students with a wide smile that belied the nervousness he, too, held at having to put them through this test. Now that the rest is over, it's time for the survival portion of the exam, he said cheerily. The test is quite simple. During the next 48 hours, a squad of Chunin will be combing the area for you. Your task is to simply hide from sight and survive off the land. A full score will be granted to those who manage to remain hidden all 48 hours. The passing score is awarded at 36 hours. Any less than that, and I'm sorry, but you're not cut out for Genin just yet, he apologized in advance. Any questions? Sakura immediately raised her hand. Iruka nodded at her, having expected her to have something to ask. Isn't it dangerous to have us do this outside the walls? She asked fearfully. After all, they weren't even Genin yet. Iruka nodded. A valid point, Sakura, he answered with a smile, causing her to reciprocate at the praise. The answer is no thanks to the assistance of the Uzumaki clan seal masters, he gestured to the two elders, who nodded or bowed at the students. The test area has been placed within very strong Fuin barriers, which will keep out any undesirables long enough for Konoha to come to your rescue, if you need it. In addition, with the Chunin on hand, you will be safe in the event of unexpected trouble. Sakura nodded, still a little dubious about the safety of the test, but sufficiently mollified to let it go. Seeing no more questions, and quite a few eager faces, Iruka smiled before glancing at the Hokage, who once again gave a nod. Turning back to his students, Iruka raised his hand. All right, then. From the moment I say so, you will have 1 hour to hide yourself, after which the Chunin will begin hunting for you. Remember, you must remain uncaught in order to pass. The Genin candidates eyed each other warily at that reminder before staring at Iruka, their eagerness barely diminished. Smiling, Iruka nodded. All right, Gio. In an instant, all 25 students jumped out of sight. Iruka sighed as he turned to the Hokage and the two Uzumaki elders. Well, that's that. Hiruzen nodded his aged head with a smile. Quite, he agreed. Please inform Izumo to have his team ready in 1 hour, Iruka-kun, he ordered pleasantly. With a nod, the Chunin vanished from sight, already on his way to Konoha. The Hokage gave the two Uzumaki a smile then. Well then, any bets on who reaches the passing mark? Hour 0. 5 Naruto had never felt so exhilarated in his life while taking a test. Usually, his academy tests had been a monotonous routine of showing up, failing or barely passing, and then returning to his usual schedule of wreaking havoc and chaos in the classroom and out. This time, however, he was in his element. Quickly going from branch to branch, Naruto finally settled on a small ditch near a river, having noted a slight crease on the side of the ditch that burrowed just beneath a big old tree. Judging from it, he would have guessed it was some animal's home, but the lack of freshly moved ground told him it was long abandoned. With some effort, and taking great pains not to use chakra, lest he give himself away, Naruto carved at the crease with his kunai, slowly digging a tunnel under the tree. Eventually realizing the hunt wasn't on just yet, he smacked himself in the forehead and began powering his hands with chakra, which served to accelerate the burrowing speed, until he soon had a cramped, but spacious enough hole in which to hide. It wasn't the most glamorous hiding place, but the nearby river gave him fast access to water, and the smell of dirt all over himself would ensure his scent was masked, both of which amounted to critical lessons in his survival classes. Just as he was about to settle in, however, he heard someone approaching, having accidentally snapped a tree branch with one of their footsteps. Cursing, Naruto guessed he'd lost track of time and the hunt was on. Cursing even further, he realized he must have picked a place near the seeker's starting point. Unfortunately, not having had the time to mask his little cave's entrance, Naruto just prayed no one looked towards the side of the ditch. His hopes were dashed, however, as he heard a somewhat familiar female voice say, "He's eyeing a hole on the S side of the D-ditch." An even more familiar sigh followed that statement. Damn it, Naruto, a hole? Really? Blinking as he recognized the voice, Naruto popped out of his hole and slowly drew his head over the edge of the ditch, only to see Shikamaru and Hinata towering above him. "Shika? Hinata? What the hell are you two doing here?" he demanded, missing the girls flinch at his confrontational tone. "You should be hiding." Shikamaru sighed as he smacked his face in exasperation. "Moron. There's no way we can pass this exam if we hide alone," he told Naruto, who blinked. "Huh? Look, our opponents are Chunin." "Chunin? That means they're good enough to go on actual tracking missions after actual missing nin or bandits. Do you really think we can hide from experienced trackers?" Shikamaru pointed out. "Especially if they have 47 hours to look for us," he added in, just to see Naruto squirm a little more as his logic destroyed Naruto's. But Iruka-sensei," Naruto protested. He would have said something about the fact that he'd previously managed to hide from Jonin-level Shinobi, but Hinata cut him off just then. "Iruka-sensei and never said we couldn't team up, and Naruto-kun," Hinata spoke up, nonetheless unable to meet his eyes due to the heavy blush she wore. Just that we had to stay hidden." "Wrong," Shikamaru stated with a sigh. He, unlike Naruto, did notice the flinch. "I mean about the hidden part, Hinata. He didn't say we had to stay hidden. He said uncaught," he stressed the word. Naruto's eyes lit up with understanding. "Uhu." Hinata, too, quickly grasped onto what Shikamaru was saying. Seeing his audience was with him, surprisingly even Naruto, Shikamaru nodded. "So here's what I propose," he stated as he crouched down, quickly emulated by Hinata. Naruto stayed peeking over the edge of the ditch. "We team up, and build a suitable hideout," he stressed the word as he eyed Naruto, who had the decency to blush. "Your concept was good, but flawed, Naruto. Ditches are the first place they'd look, as are treetops. Where do you suggest we go, then?" Naruto asked, having simply assumed they all agreed to work together. Shikamaru and Hinata noted this, earning Naruto a nod from Shikamaru and a happy, some might even say ecstatic, smile from Hinata. "I scouted out several places I think are suitable with the help of Hinata," Shikamaru stated in a no-nonsense tone. "She was the only one I could find in time before we all split up like crazy," said the boy who had a minor meltdown mere hours ago. "But I know Choji and Ino, they'll be alright." "Hell, I don't doubt Choji's already linked up with Ino." "Why not look for them, then?" asked Naruto. Shikamaru eyed him. "If we could, I would," he stated with some aggravation. "However, we're halfway into the hour and the Chunin aren't going to be pulling punches, so hunting down our comrades will take too much time. In fact, I suggest we haul ass to the designated spot and start working on the hideout, he stated. Realizing the Nara heir was right, Naruto and Hinata both nodded before the three jumped away. Hour 1. 3. Hinata had never been so embarrassed before in her life. After finding Naruto and getting him to agree with Shikamaru's plan, much to her glee, the trio had jumped towards the Nara heir's calculated hideout, quickly finding out he'd chosen a rather flat clearing. Immediately, Naruto had begun to rail at him, accusing him of trying to set them up for failure, until Shikamaru glared at him and told him to shut up so he could explain. As it turned out, Shikamaru's idea was brilliant. Whereas everyone else would naturally overlook a clearing as a hideout due to its exposed nature, this same characteristic made it one of the places where trackers would least likely investigate, judging that no one was retarded enough to stay put there. Thus, buying themselves some time, given that Shikamaru had calculated that the Chunin would know the area, and therefore overlook clearings at first, he'd quickly explained the second phase of his plan, an underground hideout. Ordinarily, such a feat would have taken weeks to build, but Shikamaru, having seen Naruto perform the Kage Bunshin during the ninjutsu test, had quickly realized the boy's extraordinary potential as a survival partner. Thus, with Hinata keeping watch with her Byakugan, and Shikamaru directing the effort, Naruto and his clones dug up a rather deep hole which was then expanded into a small cave. Fortunately, the chakra exercises that the Uzumaki Hakusho style demanded had also served to eat away at the ground, like a sort of jackhammer. While Naruto finished up the cave, Shikamaru had gone to fetch some sturdy branches and then constructed a thick, removable piece of turf to block the entrance to their hole with. It wouldn't hold if someone, say, jumped on it, but if one was merely walking over it, it would keep their hiding place secure. It was just as they were celebrating the finish of their hastily contrived project, however, that Hinata squeaked in alarm, having finally caught sight of a Chunin tracking team headed their way. Thankfully, there didn't appear to be dogs or Hyugas amongst them. Still, it served to get the three teens into the hole quickly. Unfortunately, the hole wasn't designed for quick entry and exits, and so the three remained in somewhat awkward positions, pressed against each other, even as Shikamaru closed the hole just in time for the Chunin to show up at the clearing's edge. Thus, Hinata's current situation. Having been all but shoved into the hole by Naruto, who thought he'd been chivalrous, she'd entered awkwardly and remained stuck right at the mouth of their little cavern. Unfortunately, Naruto had gone in next, thus pressing him tight against her, fueling both her imagination and her blush. Shikamaru put the cherry on top of the awkward situation by slamming into Naruto, managing to get him to press even more against her, which brought forth a small squeal. "Shoo!" Shikamaru hissed as he put the cover on the hole. "Damn it, Naruto, I swear to Cam if we get caught, it's not my fault." Naruto protested loudly, before getting elbowed in the ribs by an irritated Shikamaru. "Look, I made it the way you wanted it, okay?" And Naruto Kuniyur, Hinata tried to say he was pressing tightly against her chest which, for a 13-year-old girl, was developed ahead of time, though not by much. Even so, it embarrassed her greatly. Almost as greatly as the feeling of having her lower back and butt sticking out in the cavern. "Next time, don't shove people into holes." Shikamaru was still arguing with Naruto via hisses. "Like I had time to think about that," Naruto retorted. "Gee guys," Hinata tried to intervene, hoping that an end to the fighting would mean less squirming by Naruto. "Too, show." Shikamaru interrupted her, suddenly tense and on alert. He paused for a moment before whispering, "Hinata, can you use your Byakugan to see what's going on?" he asked. Only the whispered name of the girl's Kekii Genkai answered him. Before long, he heard a sigh of relief. "They're moving away," Hinata reported. 10 meters 20-30 ri out of the clearing and headed north. Both Naruto and Shikamaru sagged in relief. That didn't last long, however, as their argument returned in full throttle. "See? You almost got us caught, you troublesome idiot. Oi. If you wanted a bigger hole, then you should have said so while I was digging." Hinata sighed. "Only 47 more hours to go." Hour 5 after their bumpy start, Naruto had dug a wider, more accessible entrance to the cave while Hinata stood watch with her bloodline activated. They had managed to get out of the cramped hole by having Naruto use his chakra-enhanced palms carve around them, finally getting Hinata to fall into the cave, followed by Naruto and then Shikamaru. For almost the next hour, Naruto and Shikamaru had argued about what had gone wrong, with Hinata trying to work as peacemaker, with little success. Shikamaru was, uncharacteristically so, quite high-strung for the exam, which Hinata knew to blame Ino for. Still, having realized his part in the debacle they had only just managed to get themselves out of, he had conceded his part of the fault and crouched in his designated spot of the cave to think. Moments later, his eyes had opened up again and he'd outlined a more detailed plan for passing the exam, inadvertently causing Naruto to lose his bet with Hinata that Shikamaru had just fallen asleep. He now owed her 2 berries. Either way, the next few hours had gone relatively well, all things considered. With the wider opening, Shikamaru had been forced to create a larger cover, which he complained about all throughout his work. Furthermore, in order to survive, Shikamaru had pointed out the necessity of water and food. Naruto was in charge of that, given his ability to use shadow clones. Spamming about 12 of them into being, he ordered them to move out in search for food while he stayed with Hinata, who monitored the clones from the safety of their base camp. That way, if she saw one of them getting followed or tracked, she could warn Naruto in time to have him dispel them. Meanwhile, said blonde worked on digging a small hole in the cave even deeper, as Hinata had told him there was an underground current of water running a few feet down. As he did so, he reflected on how much help Hinata had been on this exam. After all, she's helped scout out this place, she'd kept watch when he dug the hideout, and now when they went out looking for food, and had found the water source. To be honest, he was somewhat perplexed. After all, prior to this test, he had very little knowledge of Hinata's abilities. She'd always seemed a shy weirdo to him, unable to vocalize much, if anything. She seemed smart, too, given that she had little trouble following Shikamaru's train of thought, though he'd never really seen her participate much in class. Overall, she was challenging his view of his world, and Naruto didn't know quite what to make of that. Okay, so maybe that sounded a little exaggerated, but to Naruto it wasn't. Living on his own for 13 years hadn't worn down his determination to get people's acknowledgement, but it did serve to solidify some profiles he'd constructed of people over the years. For instance, once Ino had recovered from the surprise of Naruto's new taijutsu form, she'd actually become a decent challenge, which he wouldn't have expected at all from the gossip. Shikamaru, as it turned out, really was a huge brain when he got his ass into gear, which he now realized was possible upon threat of tattling. Hinata, for her part, was an awesome lookout and a smart girl, if a bit shy. Plus, Hinata had a really nice laugh, which he'd found out when he'd finally hit the underwater current and managed to spray his face with water. She'd been unable to hold back a giggle, which in turn made Naruto blink at her before grinning and giving a thumbs up. Water, just like you said, Hinata-chan. Nice work, he praised her, though he was confused as to why she suddenly eeped and turned scarlet. Shikamaru had stared at the two, up at the earthen ceiling, and sighed in exasperation, muttering, "Troublesome," before closing his eyes and settling in for a nap. Soon after, his 2 companions followed suit. 43 hours remaining. Hour 13, Hinata, Shikamaru ordered. High, the shy girl acknowledged before making a hand seal. "Byakugan," she mumbled. Instantly, the veins around her eyes bulged, giving her a scowling expression that never failed to freak Naruto out. At least the scowl was only for the initial step, otherwise he'd have to keep looking away from those angry-looking eyes. A pause. "Well?" Naruto asked impatiently. Waiting around wasn't one of his strong suit. The girl blushed. "No danger," she reported. "The teams, they aren't even close." "Any of the others around?" asked Shikamaru a little irritably. When they'd woken up 2 hours ago, Naruto had complained that it wasn't fair that no one else was benefiting from their teamwork. Even Shikamaru's assurances that the smarter members of the class would figure that out hadn't persuaded the blonde to back down from his demand that they help out their classmates. Damn the blonde's instinctive sense of justice. And no wait, she quickly corrected herself before focusing her sight on an area where she could have sworn she saw a shadow. This served to extend her vision much more clearly in that area, causing her to gasp. It's Kiba-kun. Shikamaru groaned. It just figured. What's his status? The girl nodded. He seems exhausted, she reported. He keeps looking around. Akamaru is with him. Shikamaru nodded. He's probably being chased, he concluded before clicking his tongue irritably. Damn it, this isn't good. Why the hell not? Demanded Naruto. We can just go up, grab him, and bring him back here. And risk having our scent tracked all the way to the hideout, shot back Shikamaru. Even if we masked our scents, what about our tracks? These are chunin, not amateurs. So what do you propose we do? Just leave Kiba hanging? Naruto retorted heatedly. Just shut up for a second, Shikamaru ordered as he made a circle with both hands and crouched in his area of the cave. Let me think. Hinata, warn me if Kiba's trackers are nearing him. It took 5 minutes before Shikamaru opened his eyes, and by that point Naruto had been about to blow his lid. I've got it, the Nara heir stated before eyeing Naruto. Naruto, make 13 shadow clones and send them to Kiba. There, have 12 of them go in different directions while the last one masks the tracks and brings Kiba here. Have Kiba help, and remember to take the longest possible route here while masking your tracks and scent. With any luck, the Chunin ought to latch onto the 12 clones' tracks and scents. Why don't I go personally? Naruto asked. Shikamaru glared at him. Did you think Kiba would just fit in nicely in this hole? The boy asked snidely. You'll be digging out Kiba's spot. Once that's done, prepare a secondary exit for us, just in case we need to leave and the Chunin find the main tunnel. Hinata, keep an eye on Kiba. If the trackers get too close, we'll have Naruto send a few more clones to distract them more offensively. All right. Naruto said with a grin, liking Plan B already. Hinata acknowledged. Good. Move out, the Nara heir ordered. Hour 17. Fortunately for Shikamaru's peace of mind, Plan B hadn't been necessary. Unfortunately for his peace of mind, he was now stuck with the two biggest loudmouths in his class. Even worse, they all had to share a cave, and when 2 of its 4 occupants had the attention span of a demented chipmunk on a sugar rush, it was all Shikamaru could do not to strangle them in their sleep. He'd considered that plan, but discarded it due to being too troublesome. That said, if the two didn't stop alternating between fighting over food and fighting over the cramped space, he couldn't be held responsible for his actions. Off to the side, Hinata eyed their leader worriedly, concerned he really might just snap. 31 hours remaining. Hour 20. Shikamaru stared deadpan at Naruto. I hate you, Naruto. It's very important to me that you understand that, he told the blonde in a dead tone as he processed their situation. Hinata giggled off to the side as their newest addition to the cave, Ino, smacked Shikamaru upside the head. Oh come on, Shikamaru. I couldn't just let her get caught, the blonde argued. Not listening. La 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 la. Shikamaru voiced loudly as he put his fingers in his ears. Once again, Ino took charge of punishing him for his rudeness by delivering another smack. Kiba stared at Shikamaru before leaning towards Hinata. Did this happen often before I came along? The giggling Hyuga heiress just nodded. 28 hours remaining. Hour 25, you're doing this on purpose, Shikamaru accused as Naruto scratched the back of his head sheepishly while Sakura made herself at home amongst the others, chatting lively. 23 hours remaining. Hour 28, damn it, Akamaru, I am not a chew toy, roared Naruto for the 7th time that evening as the puppy bit at his leg, dreaming it to be a nice, soft bone to munch on. His companions, led by a steadily more crazed Shikamaru but excluding the shy Hyuga heiress, proceeded to beat him up to within an inch of his life for interrupting their sleep again. 20 hours remaining. Hour 36. Oh, thank the log we're in the final stretch, Shikamaru muttered as he woke up tiredly, having had a horrible night thanks to Akamaru biting the crap out of Naruto. Thank the what? Asked Sakura, positive she'd heard wrong. Or Kami. Yeah. Thank Kami we're almost done, is what I said, Shikamaru quickly answered her, unbelieving that he'd actually made that slip. Sakura eyed him for a moment before shrugging and turning back to her breakfast, a bunch of wild berries Naruto's clones had gathered. Shikamaru, for his part, sighed in relief. 12 hours remaining. Hour 37, well, at least it's Choji, Shikamaru stated, earning himself another beating as Sakura and Ino demanded wrathfully why he'd protested their presence, but not that of their larger friend. Naruto sighed before welcoming Choji to the cave and quickly summoning a few clones to help him dig out enough space for him. Hinata, still in charge of keeping a lookout for the trackers, smiled at the boy as he greeted everyone politely. Hour 40 Hinata watched as Naruto and Shikamaru argued again about their newest addition. Though, truth be told, she was sort of curious about his arrival as well. Why did you seek us out, Shino-kun? She asked curiously. I was tracking you, and you weren't being chased. The taciturn boy shifted in his coat in what she guessed was the Aburame equivalent of a shrug. I didn't want to be excluded, he eventually mumbled out. Hinata's sweat dropped, even as Shikamaru was once again ganged up on by Ino and Sakura after he called them gossipy old wives. 8 hours remaining. Hour 46 Shikamaru stared at Naruto. The blonde boy fidgeted under the Nara heir's gaze, but otherwise remained with his sheepish grin. What? No more surprises? Shikamaru asked impatiently as the group began their preparations to leave. Naruto scratched the back of his head. Of course not, Shikamaru, he defended himself. It's only 2 hours to the finish. Shikamaru grunted at that assertion, but kept his suspicious gaze leveled at the blonde. For all I know, you're about to go on a rescue mission right about now to save a log-damned puppy. A what damned puppy? Ino asked, her ears perking up at the unusual swear. Sakura, too, eyed Shikamaru with suspicion. Kami damned. I said Kami damned. Shikamaru corrected himself with a note of hysteria. All the while, Naruto eyed his friend with worry. Ever since the test had begun, Shikamaru had been acting very unusual. Were moms really that scary? 2 hours remaining. Finally, the time arrived when the test finally came to an end. Under the direction of Shikamaru, who was one more unexpected factor away from going crazy, 8 of the graduate candidates filed out of the tunnel and grinned at each other as they realized they'd spent the whole 48 hours out of sight and uncaught. Kiba and Naruto fist-bumped, Choji ate some berries, Sakura and Ino high-fived, Hinata blushed and poked her index fingers together, Shino buzzed. No one really felt the courage to ask how the hell he did that, and Shikamaru was thanking whatever deities there be that the troublesome test was over and he could return to his leisurely way of life. Using Hinata as a guide, they then proceeded to jump their way towards where the adults were waiting, though they were all surprised, or not so surprised in the case of Sakura, Hinata, Ino, Shino, and Shikamaru, to see Sasuke standing there, waiting. From his appearance, he'd been having it rough for the past 2 days. The stare he gave the 8 other rookies, who all seemed well-fed and rested, was priceless. The Uchiha opened and closed his mouth slightly many times, as though trying to vocalize a question that just wouldn't come out. Eventually, he settled for a single-word question. How? Shikamaru shrugged. We teamed up. Made a hole in the ground. You know, when you say it like that, Naruto started. You, shush, Shikamaru snapped on reflex, having had to deal with the hyperactive blonde for 2 straight days in cramped conditions. Predictably, Naruto pouted and Hinata giggled, the two having been around, crazy, Shikamaru the longest during the test. The sound of someone clearing their throat had the rookies turn to face the Hokage, who seemed bemused at the interaction amongst the 9 students. Well, this is certainly a pleasant surprise. 9 passes exactly, he mused, before eyeing them individually. Flanking him, the Uzumaki elders nodded, while Irika approached them with a proud smile. Good work, guys, he praised them. As Hokage-sama mentioned, you lot are the only passes for your class, he informed them with a happy grin. And what's more, all 9 of you managed to hit the 48-hour mark. Well done. Naruto wasn't the only one to eye Sasuke at that announcement. If what Irika said was true, then the boy had managed to survive on his own for the full 48 hours without getting caught. Judging from his appearance, moreover, he hadn't had it easy, which just served to add on to the impressive. Yes, congratulations, Hiruzen echoed with a chuckle as he held up his pipe, smiling at the future generation of ninjas. It's quite remarkable, really. Usually, we have around 18 graduates. You should all feel proud of what you've achieved, and for setting such a high standard of success for the generations to come. The 9 rookies all glowed with pride. Yes, even Sasuke momentarily broke from his scowling expression to show pride in his work, though it just as quickly disappeared at the Hokage's praise. Now, then, if you'll follow Irika back to the academy, I believe your new forehead protectors are waiting, Hiruzen added with a smile. He thoroughly enjoyed the way the new graduates' eyes lit up at that, and watched them quickly scamper off after Irika. Left alone with the 2 Uzumaki elders, Hiruzen took a deep drag from his pipe before blowing out some smoke, eyeing the 2 cautiously. I believe you 2 may be right, he stated. Perhaps there is merit to your suggestion. The 2 elders merely smiled. It wasn't often that the Hokage could get a rise out of his Jonin hell. They were sort of trained to resist that sort of thing, but every time he did, he relished it thoroughly. This was one such time. The new exam, devised between himself and Irika, with occasional input from the Uzumaki elders, had been a smashing success to the point where it really practically eliminated the need for the teamwork test for this year's graduates, except for one particular prodigy, but then it was too much to ask for a perfect score on that end on the first try, though in the end he decided to let that requirement stand for now. Nonetheless, with exactly 9 students graduating after a grueling 2-day survival mission, they'd weeded out the unskilled right off the bat. Considering the only other village able to boast that was Kirigakure, and more due to the fact that whoever graduated during the Bloody Mist years did so as a result of having the largest body count, it was no small feat. The issue now was the teams, and thus the current situation whereby the 3 Jonin instructors he'd picked for this year's graduates were in an uproar. His advisors had wisely warned him that this would be their reaction, though like them he'd agreed it was their problem, not his. The Hokage led, and the Jonin followed whatever their own feelings were on the matter. The source of this discontent was quite simple: there would be no teams this year. Well, that wasn't quite accurate. There would be teams, just not in the classical sense of the word. The idea had blossomed out of a conversation between himself and the 2 Uzumaki elders, who'd recounted the olden days with him over sake, which, in hindsight, was becoming a regular thing between the 3 old-timers. In the process, they'd revealed that Shinobi had shunned Konoha's 4-man, team leader included, cell structure early on, something Hiruzen admittedly hadn't known. The problem with it, they'd found, was that it hyper-specialized teams to such a degree where they became useless if certain missions came up, or if, say, a recon team's mission suddenly turned into an all-out fight where retreat was either inadvisable or intolerable. In that situation, the team was screwed, and so Shinobi, not exactly having the sheer power of numbers that Konoha did, had instituted what they called the Genin pool. In effect, it was no different from the Chunin or Jonin pools, which were the standard for Konoha, too. However, Yuzushiyo had extended this structure to the Genin in order to more easily allocate the proper shinobi to the proper team for the proper mission. Moreover, such ease of switching things up allowed for the Genin to become accustomed to working with a variety of partners, and bond with their fellow shinobi. This, in turn, meant for a much more tightly knit shinobi community than even that of Konoha, and strongly encouraged their shinobi to look out for each other, regardless of team affiliations. Besides Uzushio's possession of powerful seal masters, this had been one of the village's secrets to success, allowing it to earn enough fame as to warrant the concern and later fear of three major shinobi villages and their allies. In Konoha, however, the idea had not taken root due, in part, to opposition from Danzo and the former Hokages, and the lack of necessity thanks to their huge numbers. Senju Tobarama, founder of the four-man cell arrangement, had been particularly against the Uzushio structure due to the fact that he esteemed such an arrangement to be unwieldy in terms of individual education, a great concern in villages as large as Konoha. After all, how could a limited amount of Jonin sensei deal with more than 3 times their number in students? Who would they focus on? How would they divide their time? Danzo, for his part, merely echoed these sentiments, while in reality opposing the idea, which had been brought up before by the Yondaime, on grounds that extensive exposure to fellow shinobi would quickly erode the emotion-suppressing training regimen his rude Anbu had to undergo. As old as he was, the old Warhawk was no one's fool, and he was well aware that the more a person had to interact with others, the greater the chance their conditioning would fall through. It was for that reason that he almost never sent more than one rude agent out on a mission at a time, unless extenuating circumstances called for greater manpower. Hiruzen, however, believed he had a solution for the Nidaime's professed issues with the Uzushio system. In short, he decided to mix Konoha and Uzushio's genin structure. More specifically, a baseline of 3 Jonin instructors, each masters in a particular field of study, would remain as Jonin instructors for the pool. However, for every 3 genin over 9 that graduated, an additional instructor would be added in as a consultant, full-time teacher, and/or substitute teacher as needed, allowing for a team rotational scheme in C-rank missions and above. However, in order to prevent mass shortages of competent Jonin for missions, this new structure would only come into effect for the newest batch of genin onwards. In effect, this generation would be the test drive generation. If the system worked, it would stay; if not, then it would be reverted to the old system. His 3 designated Jonin sensei, however, were perplexed and a little reluctant to commit to such a new, untested system. This is for the best, Hiruzen assured the trio as Hamura and Koharu, who'd come around to his way of thinking, nodded along at his flanks. Discussions with our newest allies have shown us that our system of genin sorting is highly defective, and in fact bears no relevance to the reality they will face upon becoming Chunin, where it is highly likely their teams will be broken apart to suit mission needs, he pointed out. Koharu nodded, the elderly woman giving the 3 Jonin a stern stare. Hokage-sama is correct, she agreed. With this new system implemented, we have determined that our shinobi will be much more effectively trained, as none of you are experts in all areas of shinobi training. Hamura nodded gravely. Hataki-san, you are a world-class shinobi, but where your strengths rely on ninjutsu and taijutsu, your genjutsu and fuin are below those of Yuhi-san. Likewise, Sarutobi-san has a greater mastery over elemental chakra than either of you, and is much more proficient with weapons and stands above most in battlefield tactics except perhaps for you, Hataki-san, and the Nara, he conceded, knowing Kakashi wasn't just a war machine, but also an excellent tactician. With this new arrangement, you will be able to cover each other's weaknesses and thus give your students a better chance at survival, and in so doing make this village stronger, he stated, though by the way he had spoken, it was crystal clear that the last point, more than the others, were what mattered to Hamura. By the looks of her firm nod, Koharu agreed on that point. No one could accuse Hamura and Koharu of disloyalty towards Konoha, they just happened to be more collectivist about it. Couldn't we just done set up joint training sessions, then? Asked Asuma while scratching the back of his head irritably, a lit cigarette limp between his lips. I mean, I know Inoichi, Shikaku, and Chuza were all looking forward to a new Ino Shikacho combo. They will have to swallow their expectations, Koharu snapped, making the Jonin flinch. The genin system is not here to satisfy their dreams, but to train and bring up the newest generation of defenders of Konohagakure. Koharu, Hiruzen spoke up, giving his former teammate a stern stare. The old woman clicked her tongue irritably but conceded to the Hokage and remained quiet. Hiruzen sighed as he returned his attention to the three jonin. While perhaps not delivered in the most diplomatic manner, my advisor is correct, he told them, dashing their hopes that the Hokage might be convinced otherwise. The Ino Shikacho combo of tradition is an extremely useful team combination if the mission involves capture and interrogation of targets. But what of escort missions? Assault missions? What about missions where the Nara shadow techniques or the Shintenshin is worthless, but the Akimichi enlargement techniques would be invaluable, he posed. And to an even more basic level, under the old organizational system, you would each be saddled with at least one kunoichi, he reminded them before eyeing Kakashi and Asuma with some amusement. What would you two be able to teach them about using their feminine abilities that Kurenai couldn't do better, and with much less embarrassment for all involved? He then eyed the red-eyed genjutsu mistress and gave her an amused gaze as well. And you, Kurenai, what would you be able to teach the boys about their own physical prowess and needs that Kakashi and Asuma wouldn't be able to do better, and with much less mortification? All three jonin had the decency to look somewhat abashed, though it was hard to tell with Kakashi due to that damned mask of his. Chuckling, the Hokage put his hand on a tiny stack of papers before him and slid it sideways so that 3 sheets stood independent of each other. In any case, it's been made official. These are your assignments, he told them. You may, as every year before, administer the basic teamwork exam, he assured them, giving them at least one familiar piece of the old system to grab onto. However, the teams to do so will be randomized in the spirit of fairness and to provide realistic tension. After all, we don't always have the luxury of knowing who we will be teamed up with. The 3 jonin approached to receive their orders and took them from the Hokage's hands, eyeing the paper like it was some sort of explosive tag. You have your orders. Dismissed. At the academy, a similar scene was transpiring. What do you mean, no teams? Ino all but shrieked. She'd waited for so long for this moment, only to have it ruined by Irika's announcement. Troublesome. Yeah, what gives, yelled Kiba in protest. We passed, didn't we? Indeed, this is most unusual, Shino, usually not one to speak Upever, vocalized, a buzzing of irritation surrounding him. Why? Because it is the system of Konohagakure to establish 4-man cells to carry out missions at the genin level. Dude, stop nitpicking. Does this mean we all failed the test? Sakura asked, wide-eyed as she held onto her forehead protector protectively. Irika sighed, at least glad that Naruto seemed to remain in too much a state of shock to vocalize his outrage. No, it doesn't, Irika assured Sakura. Listen, guys, it's very simple. The Hokage has decreed reforms to the actual shinobi structure of Konohagakure, and your generation is just the first one to benefit from them. Benefit how? Shikamaru asked cautiously, for once genuinely interested. After his little, alright, somewhat substantial, breakdown over the graduation exam, he'd managed to mellow out again over the next day, quickly turning once more into an easygoing slacker. Still, the idea of having no teams was intriguing, as he'd never heard of Konoha ever doing such a thing before on a genin level. Irika eyed the boy genius, having assumed he'd already put some, if not most of the pieces together. The reason there will be no teams is because, simply put, you are now all one team. As he'd expected, Shikamaru had nodded along in the manner only someone who was in on the plan could. The rest, however, seemed surprised to varying degrees. This ranged from silent shock to outright squeals, followed by Kiba's roared insistence that Ino stop doing that. Irika sighed as he checked the Hokage's letter clipped to his clipboard. Hokage-sama has decided that, upon advice duly given and considered, our old genin team system was obsolete, much like the exam was, he explained. He eyed Naruto, expecting the boy to cry out that he didn't understand. To his surprise, the boy was actually following. He'd have to look into that later. And so, in the interest of giving you all the best shot possible to becoming elite shinobi of Konohagakure, he has decided to establish, from your generation on, the genin pool. What's a pool got to do with this? Naruto asked confusedly. Irika sighed, a little surprised it had taken this long for Naruto to lose track of the lecture. Not that kind of pool, Naruto, the scarred Chunin lectured. A drawing pool, in this case. In essence, you are all, as of right now, genin. However, as missions come up you will be divided into teams based on the mission's requirements, not on predetermined selections. This time, Naruto nodded along with the rest of his classmates. So for one mission Sasuke, Shikamaru, and Seino might be paired up. However, for the next, it could be Shikamaru, Hinata, and Naruto. He missed the look of utter horror on Shikamaru's face at that prospect, though Hinata didn't and giggled softly at her friend's expense while Naruto gave Shikamaru the sweetest, most innocent smile he could muster. Or possibly Sasuke being teamed up with Ino and Sakurari. It all depends, Irika continued, oblivious to the interactions happening amongst his students. In fact, he was so in his lecture mode that he failed to notice the hearts that appeared in said two girls' eyes at his suggestion, or the look of undisguised horror on the Uchiha's face. It was, in all honesty, the most emotional thing any of his classmates had ever seen him do since he'd been 7 years old? In any case, Irika soon noted the giggles around the room and frowned, having missed the victims' expressions. Instead, he cleared his throat to regain their attention and continued. However, due to the fact that even without teams you will all require training, 3 Jonin have been assigned to the Genin pool, making it one per mission-ready team, he continued. During off time, these Jonin sensei will collaborate in educating you all further in the arts of the shinobi, so I expect you 9 to be on your best behavior around them, understood? A chorus of, "Hi, Irika-sensei," answered him, though even so he remained dubious at their sincerity. Regardless, they were now genin, and thus technically out of his hands. Very well, then. Your sensei ought to arrive in 15 minutes or so, he estimated as he glanced at the wall clock. I suggest, in the meantime, that you find a productive use for your time. With that said, Irika went to his desk and sat down, bringing out the application forms for the next semester's incoming students. Even after graduation, teachers still had a lot of work to do. 1 hour. That was how long the genin in the graduating class had to wait. Not 15 minutes, as Irika had said, but 1 full hour. Honestly, if they hadn't been assured by Shikamaru that there was no way all the Jonin sensei had planned to stand them up, the newly minted genin might have just walked out and gone home. As it was, however, they had been forced to endure each other's company, which quickly became more of a chore than a pleasurable activity due to rising levels of boredom and the inability to cope with said boredom. To such a point, in fact, that several of the rookies could have sworn they'd heard Shikamaru mutter something about the log again when Naruto began firing off random questions at him. When the Jonin sensei did arrive, then, they found themselves staring at a class full of disgruntled rookies glaring holes into them. All 3 had the decency to look a bit sheepish at their lateness, but it was the one with the slanted headband who really took the cake, as when he asked, "We not late are we?" He asked sheepishly. It was all the students could do not to slaughter the man where he stood. Kakashi chuckled nervously as he watched 9 rookies glare holes into him. Having arrived late, yet earlier than he was used to, paradoxically, Kurenai and Asuma had eyed each other for a split second before deciding to throw him under the bus for their sake, so to speak. The result of that particularly nefarious plan had been that the students now all blamed him for the 1-hour tardiness, even if all 3 had been complicit, to an extent. Simply put, they'd opted for drinks at the local bar after the Hokage's little briefing, and had lost track of time. Of course, that didn't prevent the other 2 Jonin from using him as their scapegoat, being that they really had no intention of working with kids that hated them from day one. Kakashi, on the other hand, they knew to be laid back enough that if he was really pissed off at them, would get back at them. If not, and this was infinitely more plausible, then they'd get off scot-free. It was a gamble with good odds. Either way, having passed the initial homicidal anger stage, the students had followed the 3 Jonin instructors to the rooftop, where the students, in a show of unanimous disapproval over their senseis, thus far, proven work habits, gathered up in a group along 3 rows, bunched together, while the 3 Jonin stood awkwardly in front of them. There was no mistaking the pissed-off looks the students were shooting them. Right, Kakashi started, at least having the decency not to bring out his porn to read, considering the tense atmosphere. I guess Irika already told you this, but we're your 3 instructors. He could have sworn he'd heard a duh amongst the genin, though most of them just stared at him as though asking, really, moron? Anyway, as our first exercise, I propose we introduce ourselves, to get to know each other better. How about it? He tried making himself sound excited in a vain attempt at getting the kids pumped up. It failed. After an awkward pause, Kakashi coughed into a fist and sweat dropped. Alright, I'll go first, I guess. And so began a long litany of pseudo-introductions from a Jonin sensei, which only served to heighten the genin's glares, followed by more informative introductions from said graduates, although these seemed more directed at their fellow classmates than the Jonin. Apparently, Shino's grudge-bearing habit had rubbed off on them. Kakashi eyed his colleagues for a moment, the 3 silently conferring how best to deal with the situation. To be fair, the genin had good reason to be angry at them, but if they were going to pass the next hurdle on their way to full privileged genin status, they'd need to get past that anger and focus on the mission. A couple of stairs later, Kakashi sighed as he straightened up and stretched his neck to get the kinks out. Once he did, he eyed the waiting genin for a second before unleashing the full power of his killing intent. It was, without a doubt, the single most horrifying experience the newly minted genin had ever felt. All at once, it seemed to them that their lungs had refused to continue working, and an unbearable amount of invisible pressure was being forced down upon their shoulders, making quite a few of them buckled over, even as they sat, from the sheer force of it. A couple, namely Ino and Sakura, but, much to Kakashi's surprise, not Hinata, even passed out. Even the Uchiha survivor and the Uzumaki boy were sweating bullets and doing all they could not to pass out, and from the profiles the Jonin had received, these two were by far the most likely not to buckle under such circumstances due to their rough lives. And all this happened within the span of exactly 5 seconds. The moment Kakashi relented on his ki flare, the 3 Jonin heard collective breath intakes as the genin suddenly found themselves able to breathe much easier. Sakura and Ino, who were both passed out, were slowly resuscitated by their fellow classmates before they all nervously looked at Kakashi. That was your first lesson, the masked Jonin stated with utter disinterest as his sole visible eye drooped. Killing intent, shortened to ki in our profession, he added. Consider that also your first and only warning. Kurenai, while not having enjoyed the effects that Kakashi's killing intent had on the genin, nodded grimly. Kakashi-senpai is correct, she concurred as she stepped forward and crossed her arms under her bust. You are all genin now, learn to master your emotions. This isn't a matter of acting out against a teacher. Acting out is insubordination now, and that is a military offense. Even as the genin swallowed, suddenly realizing the dangerous game they'd been playing, Asuma weighed in with his 2 cents, even as he managed to keep his overall attitude of casualness. You are all soldiers, whether you like it or not, from the moment you pass the academy exam, the smoking Jonin idly stated before taking out his cigarette and blowing some smoke into the air. He spared the, still, trembling genin a glance. You're all pretty lucky we're pretty laid back. Any other teacher would have had you all stripped of your rank and thrown back to the academy for that sort of attitude. So we're just supposed to accept bad habits from YU? Naruto demanded, never one to be intimidated into silence. Yes, Kakashi stated with the same disinterest he'd shown previously. And no. The genin blinked in confusion. If Kakashi arrives late, Asuma took over the explanation, knowing Kakashi's fondness for riling up rookies with his cryptic explanations. Then you deal with it. Maybe he's got something better to do, or maybe he's performing some task for the Hokage. Ever thought of that? He posed the question to the genin, who slowly shook their heads. We are your teachers, yes, but we are also Jonin, Kurenai reminded them. We teach you at the discretion of Hokage-sama. If his orders somehow impede our commitments to you, then you must learn to deal with it in a constructive manner, and not in ways that qualify as insubordination. However, that's outside of missions, Kakashi added in, suddenly losing the mask of disinterest and becoming serious, instantly gaining the Genin's attention. If a team leader acts with bad habits on missions, then it is no longer a matter of contradicting orders or extenuating circumstances, it's dereliction of duty and endangerment, he informed them, idly noting that the Hyuga girl seemed to be whispering something to the Kyubi Jinchuriki, who looked confused by the explanation. In that case, feel free to react. Understood, he asked, knowing from the looks of them that he'd gotten through. As expected, the Genin slowly nodded their heads in acquiescence, and all three Jonin shared a smirk. Good, because now it's time for the final test, Kakashi said, suddenly full of good humor. Even Kurenai and Asuma seemed to brighten up, as though they, too, were party to the joke. Unfortunately for the Genin, they were. Final test, parroted Kiba, beating out both Sakura and Naruto. To become Genin, Asuma explained succinctly. What the hell? Shouted Naruto as he shot to his feet, pointing at the trio of Jonin. Aren't we Genin already? What the hell was that speech for, then? You're Genin, alright, Kakashi said lazily as he eyed the blonde. But you're not yet fit for duty, not in the eyes of the Jonin, anyway. To be sure of that, the Hokage institutes a second, final exam after the academy exams to test all Genin graduates out to the fullest, just in case some of you simply got lucky during the graduation exam or are all about theory, rather than practice. None of the Jonin missed the short glance the Genin shot the pink-haired girl before returning their attention back to their three potential teachers. Though you're all Genin candidates right now, the final test will be done in teams of 3, thus simulating the conditions of a real-life mission, Kurenai informed them sternly. Please be aware that the teams have been chosen at random, and do not in any way reflect future assignments. Asuma, she prompted her colleague, who nodded and pulled out a short, folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket and began to read off of it. Team A, he began, almost flinching at having had to dispense with the traditional numeration of the Genin teams. Haruno Sakura, Aburame Shino, Akimichi Choji, he recited, noting the slightly uncomfortable demeanor of all three as they realized they knew very little about the other. Good, that'd serve the test well if his father was right, anyway. Team B, Yamanaka Ino, Inazuka Kiba, Uchiha Sasuke. A squeal and a roar of disapproval ripped through the air, and was just as quickly silenced by a sudden burst of killing intent from Kakashi, who bored a hole into the two girls with a stern glare. Thankful for the immediate solution to the auditory assault, Asuma nodded to Kakashi before finishing up. Team C, Nara Shikamaru, Hyuga Hinata, Uzumaki Naruto. While Asuma had been too busy reading, Kakashi and Kurenai had been paying close attention to the Genin's reactions to the team assignment. Sakura had slumped in defeat at her team posting, before warring against Ino's appointment, though as was stated earlier, Kakashi put a stop to that immediately. Shino seemed a little uncomfortable with the team assignments, probably due to the fact that he hadn't managed to deduce a coherent, logical reason for such a grouping. Choji, for his part, seemed uncomfortable, period. He kept glancing at Shikamaru, who'd shot him an apologetic and reassuring glance, somehow settling the big-boned boy for now. Ino, as was mentioned earlier, went squealing fangirl mode, promptly assaulting everyone's ears with her cry of victory. Kiba was wincing at the unnaturally high decibel squeal his new teammate had unleashed on his enhanced hearing, and Akamaru, too, seemed bothered by it. Both were making their disgruntlement at this undeserved assault on their hearing heard quite vociferously. Sasuke merely widened his eyes comically and took on an expression of undisguised horror for a moment before reverting to his brooding pose. The more interesting reactions, however, were from Team C. Upon realizing what the team assignments would be once Asuma had finished with Team B, Shikamaru had fainted after correctly deducing who his two new teammates were. Upon seeing this, Hinata had burst into muffled giggles much to Kurenai's surprise before realizing the same thing as Shikamaru and then blushing like a tomato as she glanced at Naruto, who merely grinned mischievously as he, too, deduced the final team pairing. Staring at this scene, all three jonin couldn't help but figure this would perhaps be an interesting assignment after all. The next morning, oh come on, Shika, say something. Please? Shikamaru glared at his harasser. It's not my fault. Naruto protested as he raised his hands defensively. To the side, Hinata couldn't help but giggle at the sight. To both teens' fascination, a vein began visibly throbbing on Shikamaru's forehead, indicating just how irritated the boy genius was. With one glare and a sweep of his hand towards a particular direction, it soon became quite clear what had caused him to be so upset. Then at least do something about your fans, the Nara heir all but roared at the boy as he motioned towards the small crowd assorted people crowding together at the edge of the training field. Naruto-sama, they could hear someone roar in support, followed by the sound of horns and drums. Ganbat. A massive banner was held high between two clansmen that Naruto could barely recognize, causing the teen, and his impromptu teammates and Jonin supervisor, to sweat drop as they read the rather rushed message of Uzumaki forever win. There were even a few who'd grabbed makeshift drums and horns to make as much noise as possible, while others seemed to enjoy just giving whoops of joy and encouragement. That's quite a commotion, Asuma noted idly with an amused smile. Naruto grinned nervously, rubbing the back of his neck. Hee, the elders warned me something like this would happen at some point during the test. I'm just surprised they didn't come around during the graduation exam. The glare Shikamaru fixed him at that point could have melted ice. Is that all of them? Asuma wondered out loud. Naruto waved him off dismissively. Nah, that's like 40 of them. We've got maybe 200 at the clan compound. Thump. Both Asuma and Naruto turned to see Shikamaru on the floor, passed out. Hinata's giggles had them redirect their attention to the Hyuga girl, who instantly blushed and looked down sheepishly. Ayano s Shikamaru-kun said something about more of T than B before passing out, she explained shyly, though the twitch at the corner of her mouth was unmistakable. For once, she was glad she wasn't the one on the ground. Naruto gave a sheepish grin at Asuma, who just sighed in exasperation as he fixed Naruto with a stern gaze. What did you do to him during the exam, Naruto? He asked, honestly not a little bewildered by the actions of the supposedly calm-headed, lazy Nara heir. As Shika would put it himself, we shared a hole. Asuma blinked. But how? He started, glancing at Shikamaru. For 2 days. Oh. Naruto nodded sagely as Asuma gave Shikamaru's passed-out form a pitying look. Yep. The Jonin gave a chuckle at the circumstances he'd gleaned from Naruto's brief explanation before nodding to Hinata. Anyway, wake him up. It's time for the test. I imagine you all followed instructions. Both teens looked queasy as they held their grumbling stomachs, though Hinata was able to hide it better as she squatted down on her haunches and gently shook Shikamaru awake. That was answer enough for Asuma, who nodded with a slight smile. Good. Understand that you won't always be in a situation where you're fully rested or fed, he lectured the three, even as Shikamaru regained consciousness. Which is why we're here at this hour of the morning for the test. The three genin candidates nodded at the information, prompting Asuma to continue. Thankfully, the Uzumaki fan squad had piped down for now. The test is simple, he told them as he drew his pocketed hand out and in so doing revealed 2 bells. I have 2 bells in my hand. The goal is to have one when the timer, he motioned to the old-fashioned kitchen timer on a nearby rock outcropping, goes off. The one that doesn't is tied up and forced to watch while his comrades eat the lunches I brought, he added, causing the three to pale and their stomachs to grumble even louder. Now, this test has usually had a 66% failure rate on average in the past, Asuma told them seriously. Meaning we could very well have only 3 new genin this year, all 9 of you, or even none at all, he added, smirking mentally as the 3 paled even more. So, when I say go, you are to try and remove the bells from my person and retain one for yourself. Understood? Shakily, the 3 genin nodded, causing Asuma to smile. Good. Then, mission start. Three blurs jumped away from him into the forest. Asuma smiled as he leaned against the rock outcropping and took a nice, long drag from his cigarette. Now, let's see if you were smart enough to catch my hint, he mused. Naruto sweat nervously as he eyed the smoking jonin from the cover of the tree he was hiding in. Before the Uzumaki clan had arrived, he would have undoubtedly attacked head-on from the get-go, but many training sessions with clansmen who were on par with Konoha Jonin had beat that out of him. He knew there was no way he could beat Asuma one-on-one, it just wasn't feasible at his power level or with the techniques he knew. Unlike Kakashi, who seemed extremely laid back, Asuma was simply cool. In both meanings of the word. He was calm-headed and someone Naruto could respect in terms of demeanor. Not once had the Jonin looked down at him since being assigned to his team. On the other hand, the blonde fervently wished he'd stop smoking, it was making his nose itch and eyes water. There was also the question of the bells. Naruto frowned as he considered his predicament. If he grabbed one of the bells, then either Shikamaru or Hinata would have to starve through lunch, and if he'd gleaned correctly from Asuma's comments about the test, then whoever failed to get a bell would also fail their genin qualification exam. Which naturally gave Naruto pause. Could he really save himself and let one of his comrades go back to the academy? Growling softly to himself, Naruto grabbed his head as the whole thing gave him a headache. Had it not been for the substantial training his kinsman had beat into him, he would have never had to confuse himself with this sort of dilemma. He would have just charged ahead and sorted things out later. Now, though, he was second-guessing himself, and boy was he hating it. A part of him wanted to seek out Hinata and Shikamaru and ask them what they thought, but he figured that was against the rules, and so restrained that impulse. Honestly, all he wanted to do was pass this stupid test and make his clan proud. Why did there have to be this sort of ridiculous test? But then the clan always emphasized looking out for each other, didn't it? Naruto froze as a smile grew on his face. That's right. His clan had taught him better than trying to advance regardless of how it affected others. The Uzumaki had always been about clan unity, so why dishonor them with this kind of victory? A sound caught his attention and he watched as Hinata rushed forward from the foliage, looking torn between decisiveness and hesitation. Clearly, she'd come to her own answer. Smirking, he raised his fingers in a cross pattern. Yeah, I guess that's the only way left to go, he mused. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. Asuma eyed the young Hyuga heiress as she charged him headlong. In the greater span of things, he couldn't blame her. The Hyuga style essentially restricted her moves to frontal attacks, something he'd never quite liked about it. Still, he was surprised she'd be the first one out. He'd always imagined the Uzumaki brat would be the first to jump the gun. Brave, Miss Hyuga, he praised her neutrally as he pushed himself off the rock outcropping, just in time to dodge to the side, with plenty of time to spare, as the girl launched a chakra-infused palm that would have done some damage if it hit. But not smart enough. As she turned to face him, he was already bringing down a fist at her, a calm look of disinterest on his face. It was just about to connect with the side of her head, however, when his instincts kicked in and he jumped back, neatly avoiding a flying kick to the head. Oh ho, he mused, a little interested now as he watched the blonde Uzumaki kid recover from his failed attack. What's this? Tag-teaming me? En Naruto-kun. Hinata exclaimed, surprised at her savior and not a little happy that he'd come for her. Hey, Hinata, Naruto greeted, albeit while keeping his gaze entirely focused on Asuma. How about we teach this old smoker a lesson? Asuma quirked an eyebrow at the bold suggestion, though he couldn't help but smile at the attitude the boy was displaying. Ho. Interesting. Hinata, for her part, needed no further prompting as she easily drew herself into the juken stance next to her crush, a half-firm half-hesitant nod confirming her assistance. Yuan. Kage Bunshin, Asuma easily deduced as he faced the two ready genin. He'd taken a gander at their chakra levels before starting the test, and there was no way the boy had this little in him already, unless he was a clone. Nice. Let's see what they've got. He made a motion for them to come at him, still unwilling to use his chakra knives. 1-on-1 2-1 night makes no difference, he told them, amused. Bring it. How about 3-on-1? He heard a voice ask him from behind, making his eyes widen. Instinctively, he jumped aside, the bells jingling just as a shadow lurched towards where he'd been. Smiling grimly, he noted Shikamaru had managed to get behind him with the help of the foliage. Had he not spoken up, Asuma had no doubt he would have succeeded with Cagemane. Lesson 1, Asuma stated with a tight smile before disappearing. Shinobi are quiet, he continued as he reappeared behind Shikamaru, who merely gave his own smirk before jumping forward, making Asuma miss his punch. Lesson 2, the Jonin continued, just as he used his other hand to grab onto Naruto's foot. Shinobi are always aware of their surroundings, he said just as he twisted around and then threw Naruto at the oncoming Hinata, bowling the two over and causing the Kage Bunshin to dissipate. Shit! Shikamaru cursed. Hinata. Fall back. Lesson 3, Asuma then said, appearing behind Hinata, a punch ready to be delivered. Shinobi never let go of their prey. His punch missed its target, unfortunately. A blur had appeared beside Hinata and then taken her away before he could put the Hyuga heiress out of commission. Nothing personal, of course, he just wanted to make sure the three understood the stakes. Still, that was quite the impromptu plan, Asuma mused as he watched two blurs move back towards the forest. Maybe they've got the answer. Chuckling, Asuma went back to the rock outcropping and leaned back, waiting once again for their next move. Damn it, we were so close. Naruto, or rather his Kage Bunshin, cursed as he punched a nearby tree. He glared at Shikamaru then. Why'd you have to speak up? You could have gotten him. Shikamaru, for his part, glared at the blonde. No, I couldn't, he shot back. Asuma's no rookie, Naruto, he's a jonin. He would have easily noted the attack once it got near enough. Even if I did catch him, there's no guarantee he wouldn't have been able to get out of trouble immediately, and you two were too far away to get to him in time to restrain him further. Naruto growled. Damn, if only the main body was there. Shikamaru raised an eyebrow. Main body? He asked, before narrowing his eyes. You're not the real Naruto, are you? He deduced. He'd had his suspicions, based on the sneak attack he'd seen the blonde perform on Asuma. Naruto was typically too straightforward to do something like that, unless he was in some sort of situation where it wasn't advisable. Naruto shook his head, confirming the boy's suspicions. I'm a Kage Bunshin, he confirmed. The real me is somewhere else. Shikamaru's eyes narrowed as he recalled his friend's ability to use the technique. He hadn't made much of a fuss about it back during the survival portion of the exam, but he had the opportunity to do so now. Yeah, about that. How the hell do you know Kage Bunshin? He asked askance, having decided that since he'd chosen not to blab about it during the graduation exam, he could do so now while minimizing the amount of people who would know. Hinata, too, seemed interested by this information, though she seemed to react to it differently, namely, giving Naruto an admiring gaze. Long story, Naruto's Kage Bunshin replied. Not to mention classified 6 ways through Sunday. TCH, troublesome, muttered Shikamaru before fixing the blonde with a calculating stare. How much punishment can you take? He asked directly, since they'd never really tested that aspect of the clones before. 1 good hit. Shikamaru blinked. That's it? Just 1 hit? He asked, disappointed. If it helps, remember that anything I learn, the main body learns, the clone offered helpfully. For the second time, Shikamaru blinked. That's incredibly useful, he muttered to himself as he crouched down and put his hands together in his usual thinking pose. Oi, again with the pose? Demanded Naruto. Shut up, I'm thinking. Shikamaru was a little irritated by the temporary team assignment he'd been given, but he was by no means willing to risk his mother's wrath by deliberately failing. Not to mention that being a civilian while in one of Konoha's prominent clans was pretty much the lowest you could get. Scrunching his eyebrows as he delved deep into his thinking process, he gathered up the variables he knew, the variables he could predict, and then what he called the X factor, those things he could not predict or plan for. Every plan of his accounted for that factor, if only to help him remain calm in the face of the unexpected. The variables he knew were pretty simple. Asuma was a Jonin, Naruto knew the Kage Bunshin, he had his shadow techniques, and Hinata was an average, if not newbie Juken practitioner. What he didn't know, on the other hand, made for a larger list. How even-tempered was Naruto? Could Hinata withstand a significant amount of pressure? How intelligent was Asuma? Could his own chakra reserves handle a fully rested Jonin if he caught the man in the cage main? These were just a few of the questions he asked himself, and to his irritation the most he had on any of them was guesswork. Still, there was Naruto's Kage Bunshin to consider. Alright, Shikamaru spoke up as he opened his eyes and fixed Naruto with a stare. The blonde had been twitching, from what he could see, in anxiety. Dispel yourself and get the main body here. Naruto nodded and immediately poofed into smoke. At the same time, Shikamaru turned his attention to Hinata. Hinata, keep your Byakugan up, we need to know what Asuma's doing at all times, he ordered. High. Byakugan. Within minutes, Naruto arrived where they were, landing on a nearby branch. What's up, Shika? He asked. I need you to make 3 Kage Bunshin, Shikamaru ordered. Within a second, his order was complete. Good. Now, get them to do exactly as I say. We're going to be testing out Asuma's skills before we do anything. Naruto grinned. Gotcha. It was the noise that first told Asuma things were about to get interesting. Looking towards the tree line, he watched as 3 clones, well, he assumed they were all clones, rushed out towards him, all of them with a kunai in hand. Asuma sighed, taking out his used cigarette and flicking it towards the ground. Here we go again, he mused as he deftly dodged a right hook to the face, kicked one of the clones in the stomach, and then proceeded to twist on his heel to punch the third in the back of the head. Predictably, all 3 poofed into smoke. Kage Bunshin, he mused again. Still can't believe that brat managed to get down the Taju. His instincts kicked in then, and he neatly bent his neck sideways in order to avoid a thrown kunai, just as 6 clones now made their way out of the forest line. Getting more complicated, isn't he? The Jonin mused. Just like with their predecessors, the 6 clones were quickly dispatched. Then, just as he was about to break out another cigarette to relax, he was forced to actually move from his sport as 6 kunai hit the ground where he'd stood. 9 clones this time. More? This kid's chakra reserves are crazy, he muttered to himself as he raced forward to meet them head-on this time. Taken off guard by the sudden aggression from the Jonin, the 9 clones quickly had their numbers reduced by half before they tried to muster a counterattack. Unfortunately, by then Asuma had the momentum on his side, and the remaining clones were destroyed in minutes. Eyeing the timer, Asuma noted that the kid still had maybe half an hour before the test was over. Sadly for them, he had yet to see them truly cooperate with each other than that impromptu ambush they'd pulled on him. Guess even Inara, Hyuga, and Jinchuriki combined couldn't pierce through the real meaning of the test. Those feelings of disappointment were only heightened as wave after wave of clones came at him, each one double the previous. By the time only 15 minutes were left, he'd been fighting over 96 clones, separated into numerous waves, if the pattern held. Then came the next wave, and Asuma was really starting to admire the Uzumaki kid for his chakra reserves. Even a Jonin like himself would have been hard-pressed with just 5, but this kid was pumping them out like they were regular Bunshin. Finally drawing out his trench knives, there was no way in hell he could take 40 genin on his own using only bare-handed taijutsu without getting hit a good few times. He raced to meet them head-on in another attempt at cutting off their momentum before they really got going. Predictably, he managed to cut a swathe right from the start, even though he wasn't channeling chakra into his blades. Even just using the dull side of the blades was enough to burst a clone. Kicking out, punching, and slashing, Asuma idly wondered how the kid had managed to raise his taijutsu skill this much since graduating as a genin. After all, his pre-genin exam test scores had been abysmal. Yet, here they were, actually giving him a light workout. A jingle caught his attention then, and he quickly jumped to the side just as a clone almost managed to grab onto the bells. Damn, he'd forgotten about that. Putting away his blades, he quickly flipped through hand seals before slamming his hands on the ground. Doton Yomi Numa, he called out, just as the ground beneath 10 or so clones turned into a muddy swamp, causing them to sink into its grasp. It wasn't as big or flashy as Jiraiya of the Sanins, but it would do for the purposes of this test. Still, he did have a little over 30 clones to still deal with a kunai whizzed by his ear then, but that wasn't what caught Asuma's attention. It was that the kunai had flown from behind him. Turning around, his eyes widened as another wave of clones charged him. That hadn't been according to pattern. Swiftly dodging an axe kick from a hasty clone, he was forced to keep flipping backwards as the two waves converged on him from all sides. Damn, that kid was good. But not good enough, he roared as he once again flipped through hand seals. Futon de Tapa, he yelled before blowing out a massive gust of wind that earned him a few seconds of respite before the wave of clones once again charged him. He grimaced as he felt one land a glancing blow to his face, but quickly dispatched the offender with a swift uppercut to the stomach. Another dived for the bells, but was just as quickly put out of commission by a rapid elbow to the back. Even then, Asuma couldn't believe how much trouble these clones were giving him. On average, Kage Bunshin weren't made for combat, but scouting. Their lack of durability made them horrible combat partners, which was why stone clones were preferred in that area. However, to use these expendable clones in this way, the boy had all the makings of a tactical genius. Wait, a small grin formed on his face, even as he kept fighting the clones. Shikamaru. That had to be it. As smart as the blonde kid could be, the idea of getting him accustomed to one wave after another, only to be blindsided with an early wave, must have been the Nara boys' handiwork. And the only reason they could have known when to strike would have been if they kept a steady watch on him, and since he couldn't feel their chakra signatures close by, he was going to assume the Hyuga girl was providing them with continuous reports. Clever. Very clever. So that's how it is, he mused as he felt himself get excited. It was a good plan, no, it was a brilliant plan. Shikamaru, Naruto, and Hinata had pooled their unique resources to hastily draw up a battle plan that was making him sweat. Alright then. Naruto. Shikamaru. Hinata. Bring it on, he yelled out his challenge with a grin. As if transmitting the feelings of the three teammates, the clones around him suddenly seemed all the more eager to fight, as they began to charge him with renewed determination. Unlike before, however, they'd abandoned their brawler type of fighting, and had settled for something that looked like the Hyuga clan's Juken. For a moment, he'd wondered if Hinata had hinged into one of the clones, but then too many of them were using similar palm-oriented strikes. Unlike the Juken, however, Asuma could tell these chakra-infused palms weren't for surgical strikes, but for unleashing heavy doses of pain, much like what he'd heard of Tsunade's chakra-based super strength. Uzumaki clan's Hakushoken, he realized with wide eyes. How'd that kid? He instinctively eyed the curiously quiet fan gallery on the edge of the training ground. As he'd expected, they'd all quieted down for the actual exam, but what surprised him most was how approving they all seemed. Had they, too, realized what the boy was using? So that's how it is, he mused, amused. He deftly dodged another palm strike and rewarded the clone with a fist to the face, dispelling it. Another dodge later, and another clone was flattened against the ground after trying to grab the bells. Man, they were starting to coordinate these attacks pretty well. 10 minutes he passed fighting the clones, but to Asuma it felt like an eternity. After all, fighting 384 opponents, whether clones or not, whether genin or not, was pretty fucking tiring after a while. And, as he got tired, he made mistakes. The first one came in the form of a glancing strike to his upper bicep, which had made his arm flare with pain. Still, he'd managed to recover in an instant and dispatch the offending clone. But then came another glancing blow to his leg, and he'd almost buckled over. The real mistake, however, came when 5 clones attacked him at once, while one went straight for the bells. Dispatching the bell one with a smack to the shoulder, he'd immediately turned his attention to the 5 oncoming clones and dispatched 4 of them when the 5th one, rather than dispel from a punch to the stomach, had merely grabbed onto him and grinned, a little winded. Not this time, Asuma-sensei, the clone, now revealed to be the original Naruto, said with a mischievous grin. Even as Asuma's eyes widened at his mistake, Naruto cried out, "Shika! Now! Kage main no jutsu!" Success, he heard behind him, just as his body froze stiffly. "Hinata! Go!" High, came a female voice from his right, though Asuma was unable to turn to see. All he felt was some stinging pain as the girl's juken strikes hit his ankles and shoulder joints. Damn, they'd caught him completely. Even if he managed to get out of the cage main now, he'd be too screwed up to put up much of a fight, even against an academy student. Bells. Now, he heard Shikamaru then order, not one to forget mission parameters apparently. "G got them!" Hinata's voice exclaimed, just as he felt something tug and snap from his belt. Still holding onto his outstretched arm, Naruto grinned at him. "We win, sensei," he declared smugly, just as the boy's kinsmen broke out into congratulatory roars. Asuma chuckled despite himself. The 3 kids had played him in good. They deserved the pass hell. After what they put him through, he immediately dismissed giving them the secondary, but optional, test to see if they would still try to save themselves individually. "That you did, Naruto. That you did." Then, just to rub it in, the timer went off. A few hours later, Asuma found his colleagues chatting away at the local dango shop, their previously arranged meeting point. They didn't even notice him coming until he was practically right on top of them. "Oh, hey Asuma, howdy, what the hell happened to you?" Kurenai cut herself off as she took in the Jonin's scrapped-up appearance. "Did you get into a fight with a bear and lose?" Asuma sighed. "I wish. Those brats really got me good," he muttered as he slumped into a seat on Kakashi's side of the booth and slammed his head on the table tiredly. "Those brother genin did this to you?" Kakashi asked, surprised. It wasn't every day a genin team could do this much damage to a jonin, after all. Hell, neither he nor Kurenai had been even remotely winded from their own tests. Kurenai had to muffle a snort of amusement, causing Asuma to give her a weak glare. "Hey, I want to see you try to take on over 100 shadow clones using only weak ninjutsu and taijutsu," he challenged, causing the two to gape. "A 100? Asked Kurenai, shaken. At least, Asuma confirmed, wishing he was back home and in bed. Curse the need to share notes with his colleagues in order to form a balanced learning schedule. "Did he use it?" asked Kakashi carefully, all 3 knowing full well that the only person remotely capable of using shadow clones within the genin ranks at the moment was Naruto. There was no need to ask what it was. "No," Asuma assured them, head still lying on the table. "Never felt an ounce of it. It was all his own chakra." "That's insane." Kurenai almost cried out, though she managed to keep it low. "What kind of genin has that much chakra?" You know what," Kakashi reminded her with a meaningful one-eyed look. He turned his attention back to Asuma then. "So they passed?" "Flying colors," the bearded jonin agreed with a slight twitch of the head that the other 2 assumed was a poor attempt at a nod. "You too?" Kurenai shrugged. "Passed, though the Aburame and Akimichi had trouble integrating their styles with each other. Haruno managed to devise the winning plan, though, after the Aburame revealed the purpose of the test." Asuma nodded as he processed the information. Both then turned to Kakashi, who'd specifically requested to test the team with the Uchiha. Unsurprisingly, he flinched. "Passed though barely," he admitted after a moment of silence. "It was exactly like the report said. Sasuke has trouble working with others," he stated. Kiba was all for teaming up against me, but Ino fears a reason why her file had fangirl under warning notes. Kurenai frowned at this, while Asuma flinched. It was no secret that Kurenai hated two things over anything else: men who looked down on kunoichi because of their gender, and women who were a disgrace to the title, notably, fangirls. How'd they pass? She asked dangerously. If she found out Kakashi had passed them for the sake of passing the Uchiha, his genitals would be forfeit. Kakashi rubbed the back of his head nervously. Well, YC's timer ran out, so I tied Kiba to the post, then went on about the memorial stone and everything. I think Sasuke figured it out then, because when I came back to scare them, he and Ino were sharing their food with Kiba. Lucky pass, then, Asuma grumbled. Why the hell had he been the only one stuck with the smart and aggressive ones? Also, I hate you, Hataki. Just so you know. Kakashi chuckled nervously, even as he weathered Kurenai's disapproving stare and Asuma's pain-filled grumbling. Oh man, that was great. Did you see how we took him down? Man, it was epic. Yep, Naruto was already gloating about their victory over Asuma. Damn it, Naruto, will you stop being so troublesome and pipe down? Shikamaru growled as he tried to eat in peace. It was bad enough his teammates had been the very same who'd nearly driven him up a wall during the survival exam, but now the loudmouth had to ruin his meal? You guys are lucky, we didn't get a single hit in against Kurenai-sensei, Sakura mumbled as she idly twirled her chopsticks in the noodles on her plate. The 9 rookies, after passing their tests, had all agreed to meet up for a celebratory luncheon at Yakiniku-Q, the most famous barbecue restaurant in Konoha. To be fair, that wasn't the point, Shino spoke up then as he held up a piece of steak between his chopsticks. Why? Because the point was teamwork, not physical victory. Even so, I agree with my teammate. I am envious of your victory over Sarutobi Asuma. Why? Because dude, let it go, Kiba interrupted him just before tearing off a piece of meat and throwing it at Akamaru, who caught it midair. Shino frowned at him, not that anyone could tell, but remained quiet. Bah, he couldn't have been all that. Ino broke into the conversation after having eaten a bit of her salad. We couldn't even get a hit in against Kakashi. Kakashi used to be ANBU, though, Choji pointed out. Dad always spoke very highly of him. And Kurenai-sensei is a new jonin, Sakura informed her friends. They say Asuma-sensei used to be one of the 12 guardian ninja, though, so it's still very impressive you guys managed to take him down, she added, smiling at Hinata, who'd conformed herself with eating quietly. The comment served to make the indigo-haired girl blush. It was nothing as Shikamaru-kun and Naruto-kun did most of the work, she squeaked when Naruto suddenly put an arm around her shoulders and grinned at the group. Come on. Don't say that. Without you, we'd have been screwed, right Shikamaru? He questioned his pineapple-haired friend, who just ignored him. Oh, come on, Shika. You can't still be mad at me because of the survival test. Humph, said boy merely grunted before returning to his food. Over on the other side of the table, Sasuke gave the Nara heir a respectful glance before returning to his own food. He'd initially rejected the proposition to join the others for lunch, but after Shikamaru had pointed out that they'd have to cooperate in the future, he'd reluctantly agreed. To be frank, he was surprised he was feeling as relaxed as he did. But, why no? What do you all think of this genin pool thing? Kiba spoke up, immediately killing off any side conversations as the genin quietly pondered the situation. They'd all grown up learning and hearing of specific teams performing missions that made those teams famous worldwide. It's unexpected, Shikamaru was the first to speak up. Troublesome, too. But I guess I can see the wisdom in it. Really? Why don't you enlighten us, oh grand brain? Ino drawled out mockingly. She knew Shikamaru was nowhere near as stupid as his lazy demeanor made him out to be, having grown up together. Still, that didn't make it any less fun to tease him. TCH. Troublesome blondes, he muttered before flinching forward as Ino nailed him in the temple with an errant chopstick. Fine. Fine, he finally agreed before eyeing the other genin. Look, we're all pretty damn good at something, right? How do you mean, Shikamaru-kun? Hinata spoke up, a little embarrassed at her own daring. Kiba, Shino, Hinateu 3 would be perfect as a tracker team, right? Shikamaru suggested, earning a few tentative nods. Alright, then what about when your team faces an ambush? How do you get out of a situation with superior numbers against you? Who's your heavy hitter? Kiba would be the logical choice, Shino answered, for once straightforward and not adding in anything unnecessary. But Kiba's techniques rely on Akamaru, right? Shikamaru countered, deflating the pleased look on Kiba's face. So what happens if Akamaru is incapacitated? Hey, not all of them, he grouched. But the most powerful ones do, Shikamaru waved aside his objections. In that situation, you're all dead, unless you have some powerful backup. However, if you had, say, Sasuke, Choji, or Naruto around instead of one of you three, then you'd have much greater odds of extraction while still holding up a good degree of tracking skills. The genin pondered on that for a while before nodding. Is that why the teams were set up that way? Asked Sakura as she narrowed her eyes. One heavy hitter, one tracker, and one air, she floundered, not knowing how she'd really qualify herself. After all, what was she good at this point? To be fair, though, she was a newly minted genin. Shikamaru nodded as he raised a finger. I think so, he stated. They say it was random, but the way the three teams were identically arranged means that was just a load of crap. Look, guys, he then said seriously, grabbing their attention. The Jonin aren't stupid. What we just tested against. They were probably holding back to a tenth or less of their actual skills. Don't go thinking we did the impossible. Anyone can fight a handicapped Jonin. Silence permeated the room as they sobered up their expectations of their Jonin sensei. So basically don't act like Naruto? Kiba carefully posed. Shikamaru nodded immediately and without hesitation. Exactly. Hey! Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, and share. Want early audio-only versions? Join me on Patreon, link in description. I'm Fox Sage, see you next time.